The hidden story of Mary Magdalene rests in the Vatican's deepest chambers, bound in mysteries protected behind sealed archives and suppressed manuscripts. Through the ages, her truth has drifted like smoke through those hushed hallways, depicted in pieces across history's canvas, yet never revealed completely. She embodied something greater than the figure they permitted her to become. This is where our journey into the unknown starts. Tonight we trace the silent path through devotion and doubt, beyond barred entrances and murmured identities. If uncovering enigmas like this speaks to you, remember to subscribe for what's coming next. Now get comfortable, shut your eyes, and allow the narrative to emerge. A lone flame dances in the darkness, its glow touching rows of weathered manuscripts and parchments. The atmosphere is crisp and motionless, bearing the subtle fragrance of aged vellum and limestone. High overhead, the chimes of St. Peter's Basilica announce the changing hour, their resonance floating downward like an echo from the past. Within this conjured chamber, buried beneath the Vatican, our tale takes shape. Mary Magdalene's identity has journeyed across time like a breath of wind. In the gentle rays of morning, you could envision her treading alongside the Sea of Galilee, her steps sinking into moist shoreline. The Gospels position her at the core of the narrative that forged the Christian faith. She remained when others withdrew. She remained when darkness descended. The historical accounts reveal little about her existence before encountering Jesus. Magdala, where she came from, was a harbour settlement, vibrant with the aroma of brine and the chatter of merchants' exchanges. Within this commotion, she existed, until an encounter transformed her journey permanently. Released from a burden she had borne, she accompanied him from settlement to settlement, her existence a strand threaded through his closing chapters. One can easily picture her beneath the execution post, near enough to detect every struggling exhale. Her bravery crystallized in that quietness, and maybe it was this fortitude that disturbed those who erased her from subsequent records. Grief surrounding Jerusalem created a heaviness thick with sorrow. Mary approached the burial garden not carrying expectation, but bearing affection. The boulder had been displaced. She moved closer, shaking, and discovered the chamber vacant. Within the Gospels, she is the one who stays, and she is the one to whom the resurrected Christ initially reveals himself. During an era when a woman's account was frequently discounted, this selection distinguished her. Subsequently named the messenger to the messengers, her position was simultaneously respected and, for certain individuals, unsettling authority in the nascent church was forming. Still here stood a woman at the nucleus of its most profound instant. That sunrise in the garden could never be removed without removing the reality itself. Her influence has persisted, overshadowed by efforts to diminish or disguise it. Yet in that initial daybreak, she remains unwavering, carrying a declaration no suppression could contain eternally. During the period afterward, Mary's testimony transmitted the revelation to those who had dispersed in terror. Some accepted her immediately, their spirits lifting with anticipation. Others wavered, their thoughts wrestling to acknowledge that she, rather than they, had been the initial one to witness him in a society where communal influence belonged to males. Her declaration stood like a boulder in the current's path, disrupting conventions that had endured unchanged for generations. It wasn't merely the proclamation that held significance, but who delivered it. She had remained at the cross when others looked away. She had journeyed to the tomb when others concealed themselves. And presently she was granted the knowledge that mortality had not been the closing statement. This confidence designated her as someone intimate to the essence of the narrative, someone whose position could not be dismissed as coincidence. Yet history is moulded not solely by what occurs, but by the manner it is recounted. Within the initial assemblies of followers, narratives were transmitted through spoken tradition before being recorded, particulars transformed in the recounting. Focus shifted. Across time, the recollection of Mary as an authority started to fade. Some retained her power, her proximity to Jesus, and her standing as the primary observer. Others started to merge her into different narratives, blending her with women of separate identities and histories. Within certain retellings, she evolved less of an authority and more of a regretful figure. Her confident existence at the centre of the resurrection narrative mellowed into the portrayal of someone requiring absolution rather than someone bearing sacred mandate. It represented a transformation that maybe rendered her position more palatable to the directing influences of the expanding church. The transformation wasn't immediate. It occurred through subtle methods across generations as authorities laboured to establish a defined structure within the belief system. Within that structure, power descended from the apostles across the bishops, and ultimately to the leader of the church. A woman at the nucleus of the most significant instant in their chronicle did not integrate smoothly into that framework. Nevertheless, the evidence of her authentic position never disappeared entirely. Within early texts, in the statements of initial adherents, and in the portions of Gospels that would subsequently be concealed or misplaced, Mary Magdalene still emerges, as she initially was, positioned in the morning radiance, bearing a declaration that could not be suppressed. And maybe this is where the source of apprehension originates. For the Vatican and for those who protected the authorized narrative, Mary was not merely a character from antiquity. She was a testament that power could manifest where it was least anticipated, that reality could articulate in a tone the world was not equipped to acknowledge. Within the extended passages of influence, such testaments are seldom embraced. There exists a designation that drifts through the atmosphere like vapour, when individuals discuss the Vatican's most guarded mysteries. It is not a holy person's designation, or a pontiff's is the heading of a volume murmured more frequently than voiced. They name it the Grand Grimoire, others name it the Red Dragon. It is claimed to be among the most dreaded volumes ever composed, not due to containing a narrative, but due to what it purports to instruct. Some maintain it preserves ceremonies, cryptic markings, and archaic phrases intended to invoke forces not intended for mortal grasp. Some additionally claim it holds the actual designation of Lucifer, inscribed in deteriorating pigment on a damaged sheet near the opening. Nobody understands with certainty where the volume originated. Some claim it initially surfaced in the 15th century. Others claim it is more ancient, considerably more ancient, duplicated from something vastly more primordial. Narratives connect it to King Solomon, the sagacious monarch from the Bible, who was claimed to command entities with his utterances. Whether accurate or not, the volume has perpetually been enveloped by enigma and dread. The Church has never acknowledged the Grand Grimoire's reality, but that has not halted the speculation. For countless years there have been subdued assertions that the sole authentic duplicate is concealed within the barriers of the Vatican, secured away, protected, observed by those who do not discuss what they safeguard. The covering is claimed to be a profound crimson, nearly the shade of dehydrated blood. No heading, no identifications, only a peculiar ring etched into the hide with 4 symbols inside that nobody has managed to decipher. Some claim it seems heated to contact. Others claim the volume becomes weightier the extended you grasp it. These are accounts shared in hushed tones by individuals who understand better than to pose inquiries in the open. There have been imitations, naturally, duplicates fashioned by inquisitive individuals attempting to speculate what might be contained. Yet the authentic edition, if it exists whatsoever, is never displayed, never observed. The Vatican's reticence only contributes to the enigma. No repudiation, no statement. Simply the identical stillness that perpetually encompasses its most concealed matters. What renders the Grand Grimoire distinctive is not simply what it might express, it is what it might accomplish. Some maintain it was composed to dominate energies beyond our reality. Others claim it is an examination, a snare, a volume that revolves on the individual who attempts to interpret it. A handful even assert it was never intended for individuals whatsoever, that it was duplicated manually indeed, but the phrases were provided from elsewhere. Nobody can demonstrate these matters. Nobody has grasped the volume and discussed it afterward. Yet even without demonstration, the presence of the red dragon still extends through duration. And within the Vatican's profound reticence, that presence has not diminished. It anticipates, uninterpreted, and considerably alive. Ages proceeded onward, and the church that originated in modest chambers and exposed courtyards transformed into an organization of tremendous power. Magnificent cathedrals emerged from the earth, their limestone barriers rising above municipal plazas, their chimes summoning thousands to devotion in Rome. The Vatican expanded not solely as the essence of belief, but as the nucleus of authority, where choices influenced the sacred existences of realms. Within these barriers, history was maintained in pigment and manuscript. Copyists reproduced sacred manuscripts manually, and custodians preserved them in quarters that scarce would witness. The Vatican protected these compositions as valuables, but protecting also signified selecting what the devout would interpret and what they would never discover. It was within this meticulous formation of the account that Mary Magdalene's position persisted to alter. Her portrayal evolved into one of contrition more than authority. The narrative communicated from lecterns was that she had been a transgressor who discovered pardon, a declaration that was simple to deliver and extensively acknowledged. Yet in this communication, the recollection of her as the initial observer to the resurrection, as the one granted a sacred declaration, was obscured. She evolved into an emblem of compassion rather than of mandate. For certain individuals, this was more secure. A woman who was pardoned presented no opposition to the framework of the Church. A woman who had guided could disturb it. The selection to accentuate one edition of her existence over another was not executed in haste. It developed across generations, strengthened in imagery, teachings and custom. Representations from the Middle Ages frequently displayed her in lamentation, her cranium lowered, grasping a container of balm. These portrayals were exquisite, but they communicated only a fraction of the reality. Scarce creations of imagery displayed her positioned, elevated, articulating with assurance or instructing others as the Gospels indicate she previously accomplished. In seclusion, there may have been those who understood a more complete narrative. In concealed sections of the Vatican Library, there could be manuscripts that discuss her in methods the community never perceives. Academics and religious officials who managed these creations might have interpreted phrases that depicted a contrasting representation, one nearer to the Mary of the initial periods. Yet these tones remained secured away, their sheets closed to the society. For the Vatican, the justifications for this vigilance may have been intricate. Maybe it was about safeguarding cohesion, preventing discussions that could fragment the devout. Maybe it was about maintaining to a custom that had directed the Church for ages. Or maybe it was about influence and the comprehension that particular realities, if extensively recognised, could alter the equilibrium. Whatever the justification, the suppression has continued, and within that suppression, Mary Magdalene's most genuine narrative anticipates, like a secured correspondence in a shadowed chamber, anticipating the occasion someone ventures to access it and permit the illumination to descend upon the phrases. Envision for an instant the initial adherents of Jesus, assembling in the faint radiance of an oil lantern. They position in a modest chamber, the atmosphere heated with the aroma of grain and fermented beverage, their tones subdued as they remember the periods they traversed beside him. Present with them is Mary Magdalene, her existence constant and composed. She articulates not as someone external, but as one who had remained at the absolute essence of the most significant instant they had experienced, Her phrases bear the significance of someone who had observed with her personal vision and perceived with her personal perception. Within those initial years, the belief was moulded not by inscribed volumes, but by existing recollection. Individuals communicated the narratives they had observed, transferring them from one assembly to the subsequent. The descriptions were dynamic, transforming marginally with each communication, influenced by the tones and convictions of the narrators. Some repeated Mary's description as she communicated it, respecting her position without reluctance. Others may have mellowed her existence in their additions, allocating more consideration to the apostles who were males. As duration transferred, authority in the expanding Christian collective started to assume a more distinct configuration. Particular tones acquired more power, and with power arrived the capacity to determine which narratives would be maintained precisely as they were and which would be reformed. Within this procedure, Mary's position as a courier of the resurrection started to encounter subdued opposition. A woman carrying such mandate did not correspond the configuration of authority the Church was starting to establish into. Nevertheless, the evidence of her authentic narrative were not eliminated. Initial Christian compositions beyond the recognizable Gospels discussed her with consideration, even admiration. In total, she is displayed in dialogue with Jesus, posing inquiries and obtaining responses that indicate a profound comprehension of sacred realities. These manuscripts did not perpetually endure in the authorized assemblies, but they persisted in concealed texts and in the customs of modest, dispersed assemblies. It is here that the origins of the Vatican's discomfort can be observed. If these compositions had been positioned alongside the authorized Gospels, the representation of Mary Magdalene would have been vastly more abundant and vastly more opposing to the structure that was being constructed. Her demonstration might have motivated generations of women to advance into positions of instruction and authority. It might have guided followers to perceive mandate as something that could exist beyond the structured hierarchy. The chamber of that envisioned assembly dissolves into obscurity, yet the resonance of her tone seems to persist. It is constant, not attempting to demand influence for herself, but to distribute what she's been provided. This is the tone that reverberates softly through history, occasionally perceived, occasionally suppressed, but never genuinely vanished. And it is the tone that even presently still provokes inquiries within the protected barriers of the Vatican. Ages subsequently, those initial tones were extensively vanished, substituted by pigment on manuscript and the significance of authorized proclamations. The Church had expanded into an extensive framework, its power extending across kingdoms and dominions. By the period the Middle Ages assumed control, the portrayal of Mary Magdalene that most individuals understood was no extended the resolute observer in the garden, rather the regretful transgressor crouching in lamentation. This addition was not originated from the initial descriptions, but from a meticulous interweaving together of contrasting women's narratives into one. During the 6th century, Pope Gregory I presented a teaching that connected Mary Magdalene with Mary of Bethany and with another unidentified woman characterized as a transgressor. Within a solitary instant of instruction, the portrayal of a female authority was converted into that of a woman requiring absolution. This was a declaration that corresponded appropriately with the ethical teachings of the period. It promoted modesty, contrition and reliance on the direction of the Church. Still, it also removed something essential, the mandate and bravery that Mary had displayed from the absolute beginning. From that juncture ahead, teachings, representations and performances strengthened this modified portrayal. Creative individuals frequently depicted her with extended, cascading strands, lowered vision and a container of balm. Within her grasp, she evolved into an emblem of God's compassion toward transgressors, rather than a demonstration of God's confidence in a woman's authority. This portrayal established itself profoundly in the spirits of the devout, influencing how generations would recognize her. The Vatican's collections and repositories, even subsequently, may have held compositions that communicated a contrasting narrative. Texts that discussed Mary's proximity to Jesus, her position as instructor, and her comprehension of profound sacred realities could have been secured away. Such manuscripts, if extensively interpreted, might have opposed the established structure of the Church. They might have guided some to inquiry why her position had been so substantially modified in the communal communication. Influence during the Middle Ages was intimately connected to structure. The Church perceived itself as the protector of that structure, and it frequently selected to safeguard cohesion by regulating which narratives were communicated. Within this atmosphere, Mary's initial portrayal was not simply neglected. It was reformed to fulfill a function. Nevertheless, her most genuine essence could not be thoroughly concealed. Within subdued sections of Europe, modest collectives and particular academics murmured about the discrepancies between the communal portrayal and the more ancient, more challenging to locate descriptions. These murmurs were subdued but relentless, like a remote chime that resonates even when nobody's in the structure. The Vatican may have apprehended not the woman herself, but the likelihood that the reality about her could alter the equilibrium of mandate. Within the magnificent chambers of influence, even a solitary tone from the antiquity can reverberate sufficiently to contact the contemporary, if it is ever permitted to articulate again. By the period the Renaissance emerged, the society had started to alter. Concepts journeyed more rapidly, transported by merchants, investigators, and, in duration, the printing apparatus. Imagery prospered, occupying churches and residences with scenes from Scripture. Still, the portrayal of Mary Magdalene remained considerably the identical as it had been for ages. She was still displayed as the regretful, frequently solitary. Her vision elevated toward paradise in regret. The strata of her authentic narrative rested concealed beneath these meticulously fabricated representations. Within some representations, though, a contrasting Mary seemed to surface. An inclination of the cranium, the assurance in her observation, the method she remained among the disciples. Within particular creations, these particulars suggested at something additional. Maybe the creative individuals had interpreted more ancient descriptions or perceived murmurs of her actual position. Maybe they desired to deposit modest indications for those who would observe attentively. Simultaneously, academics were starting to investigate more profoundly into early manuscripts. Some examined the Greek and Latin of the initial Gospels, detecting contrasts in how Mary was characterized. Others encountered compositions that had never been incorporated in the authorized collection, records that discussed her as an instructor, a confidant, and an authority. Yet such revelations did not transfer their method simply into the communal observation. The Church still regulated considerably of what could be reproduced and extensively distributed, and any opposition to the established structure was encountered with vigilance, if not complete suppression. Within the Vatican itself, the repositories expanded, compartments occupied with parchments, texts, and correspondence from across the ages. Present with them, it is claimed, are accounts from the initial periods of the belief, some inscribed by individuals that may have recognized Mary herself. If these accounts exist, they have not been positioned on communal exhibition. The determination to maintain them concealed may have been motivated by a conviction that particular realities would perplex or even fragment the devout. Or maybe it was comprehended that disclosing them could guide to inquiries about the Church's extensively communicated history. Mary's narrative had evolved into more than a subject of belief. It had evolved into fraction of the foundation on which the mandate of the Church rested. To alter it presently would be to contact the sources of that framework. And still, even in the Renaissance, there were those who softly questioned if the edition communicated in magnificent cathedrals was the complete reality. Within the hushed passages of the Vatican, beneath surfaces decorated with scenes of paradise, her designation might still be located in the most ancient of volumes. There it anticipates, not eliminated, but resting like a grain beneath the earth, equipped to ascend again if ever provided the illumination. Maybe this is the apprehension that one occasion Mary Magdalene's tone will restore with all the power it previously transported, and the society will have to perceive her as she genuinely was. As the ages revolved and the society advanced into the era of investigation, vessels transported not solely commodities and individuals, but also concepts across seas. Still within the Vatican barriers, the communication of Mary Magdalene's narrative remained constant and regulated her portrayal, as the regretful had evolved so profoundly interwoven into teachings, melodies, and sacred imagery that scarce questioned it openly. Yet in modest academic circles and concealed religious establishments, other editions of her narrative still transferred softly from individual to individual. Some of these compositions originated from initial Christian collectives whose tones had been displaced to the peripheries of history. They discussed Mary not solely as the initial observer to the resurrection, but as one who had been instructed directly by Jesus, who comprehended enigmas others could not yet understand. Within some descriptions, she remained in transparent disagreement with the male disciples, opposing them with assurance. Such depictions depicted her as a character of sacred mandate, something the organised hierarchy of the subsequent church could not simply permit. This conflict between the communal portrayal and the secluded account intensified across duration. The Vatican protected its repositories with vigilance, permitting solely trusted academics to observe particular assemblies. For those who accessed those chambers, the atmosphere was substantial with the significance of ages. Extended surfaces grasped bound texts, their sheets delicate still remaining dynamic with pigment that communicated neglected narratives. If any of these communicated Mary's narrative in its more complete configuration, they remained beyond contact for most of the society. Meanwhile, in settlements and hamlets across Europe, her commemoration occasion was acknowledged each year. Churches resonated their chimes, religious officials delivered of her contrition, and representations of her in cascading garments and modest stances were exhibited for all to observe. This commitment was authentic, but it was constructed upon an edition of her existence that had been moulded to correspond the Church's declaration. The portrayal of Mary as an authority, a tone equivalent to the Apostles', was nearly nowhere to be discovered, and still, even in these ages, traditions endured in unexpected locations. Across the coastline of southern France, some communicated of Mary reaching by vessel, evading persecution, and existing out her periods in subdued devotion in a stone cavern. Within this communication she was neither a transgressor nor a hushed character, but a sacred woman whose existence attracted seekers from distant away. These regional customs remained separate from the authorized narrative, like modest currents that decline to connect the primary waterway. It is in these dispersed recollections and concealed manuscripts that the more thorough Mary seems to anticipate. The Vatican's apprehension may not have been of her as an individual extensively vanished, but of the likelihood that one occasion her authentic narrative would emerge in complete observation. And when it accomplished, it might request the devout to perceive their history and the influence within it in a modified illumination. By the emergence of the 19th century, the society was transforming in methods that could no extended be held within the barriers of residences or the enclosures of religious establishments. Printing apparatuses were distributing faster than previously. Volumes were contacting modified sections of the planet, and common individuals were starting to interpret an inquiry in methods that previously would have been inconceivable. The Vatican still grasped its repositories in protected suppression, but murmurs about neglected gospels and alternative histories started to expand more vociferous. Within some circles, Mary Magdalene's portrayal started to mellow into something more intricate than the regretful. Passionate writers and creative individuals of the 19th century discovered in her a character simultaneously exquisite and enigmatic. They discussed her bravery, her devotion, her and her proximity to Jesus. This was not a complete restoration to her initial position, but it transported suggestions of the authority she might previously have been. Within exhibitions, surfaces displayed her not solely in lamentation, but in instants of subdued power, observing into the expanse as if remembering something she could not articulate vocally. These alterations did not proceed undetected. The Vatican, vigilant about the currents of alteration persisted to advance the more secure, customary portrayal of Mary. It was simpler to articulate of her as a demonstration of contrition than to access the entrance to inquiries about why her authority had been positioned aside. Nevertheless, the expanding curiosity in biblical history beyond the Church's immediate regulation signified that ancient texts and unfamiliar descriptions were being examined with renewed vision. Some investigators and academics journeyed to primordial territories in pursuit of neglected compositions. Occasionally they restored with portions of manuscripts that discussed in tones extensively suppressed. A handful of these referenced Mary in methods that corresponded neither the authorized teachings nor the prevalent imagery. Within them, she was neither transgressor nor presence, but a trusted carrier of sagacity. Whether these portions contacted the Vatican's consideration is not definite. Yet the concept that such records could exist was sufficient to disturb the protectors of custom. Seekers still accessed locations connected to her tradition, particularly in southern France, where regional conviction grasped that she had existed in isolation for numerous years. The caverns and sanctuaries there were occupied with flames and subdued devotions, their atmosphere substantial with commitment. To these seekers she was a holy person of persisting existence, one who could perceive them even from beyond the ages. Still beyond these demonstrations of belief, the inquiry remained. What would transpire if the complete reality of her existence arrived to illumination? Within a century famished for understanding and transformation, that reality might not be held. Maybe this was why the Vatican, even in an era of magnificent alteration, maintained its suppression. For in the suppression the narrative could remain as it had been communicated, uncontacted, unopposed, and secure. Yet suppression, like limestone, can fracture when the accurate compression arrives. And somewhere Mary's authentic tone still anticipates for that instant. The 20th century transported with it revelations that would start to release the peripheries of extensively grasped narratives. Within the arid particles of Egypt, a container secured for more than 1,000 years was fractured accessible, disclosing the Nag Hammadi manuscripts. Present with these primordial compositions was the Gospel of Mary, a creation that discussed with a tone. Dissimilar the authorized Gospels, it communicated of representations and instructions provided to Mary Magdalene, positioning her in a position of profound comprehension and sacred direction. For academics, this was not thoroughly modified. Portions of such compositions had been recognized, but to grasp the sheets in their individuals was to sense history respiring again. The phrases depicted her not as a regretful crouching in the presences, but rather as one who remained among the disciples, articulating with precision and mandate. Within this communication she consoled the others after Jesus had departed, clarifying realities he had distributed with her in seclusion. The Vatican's communal reaction to these revelations was subdued. There was no transparent repudiation, but neither was there an acceptance of the modified material. Authorized instruction remained established in the portrayal that had been moulded across the ages. For numerous followers, the Gospel of Mary remained undiscovered, its phrases existing mostly in educational examinations and specialized volumes. Still, even in this subdued, the discovery provoked a profound inquisitiveness in those who had perpetually questioned if there was additional to her narrative. Within churches across the society, representations still displayed the recognizable character, cascading strands, lowered cranium container in individual. Teachings still discussed contrition, commitment, and devotion. Yet in educational chambers, in the sheets of academic publications, and in delayed evening dialogues among those attracted to history's enigmas, a contrasting Mary was starting to surface. Composers and producers assumed awareness. Some interwove her into historical narratives or speculative creations, suggesting at mysteries concealed by the Vatican. Others requested in communal presentations whether her authority had been positioned aside to maintain a male-focused structure. The inquiries were not vocalized, but they were constant, and they discovered an audience equipped to perceive. Within the Vatican collection, the compartments still remained substantial with ages of protected compositions. Whether the protectors of those chambers understood of other accounts that could validate the more complete narrative is undiscovered. What is definite is that the Church, across all these alterations, grasped to its selected portrayal of her. Maybe it was out of a desire to safeguard cohesion, maybe from an apprehension of the disorder that might succeed if extensively concealed particulars arrived to illumination. The Gospel of Mary, previously buried in particles, had endured against all probabilities. Its endurance was a subdued testament that history has a method of resurfacing, regardless how profound it is concealed. And within that endurance, the tone of Mary Magdalene had articulated again. Subdued, but transparent, sufficient for those prepared to perceive. As the century transferred ahead, the Society's fascination with concealed histories expanded. By the initial 2000s, Mary Magdalene's designation was on the expressions of millions. Not due to modified church instruction, but due to prevalent volumes and productions. Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code ignited a current of inquisitiveness, merging reality invention and speculation into a narrative that captured imaginations everywhere. Within that communication, Mary was not solely a trusted adherent of Jesus, but potentially his spouse and the protector of a lineage, an assertion that was distant from demonstrated, still powerful, sufficient to provoke discussion in residential chambers and presentation chambers alike. The Vatican reacted vigilantly. It dismissed the invented assertions. Still, in accomplishing so, it prevented engaging with the more profound historical inquiry of why Mary's authentic position had been so modified across the ages. Authorized declarations persisted to respect her as the devoted observer to the resurrection, but they did not revisit the selections that had moulded her communal portrayal. While the world moved on, researchers continued their patient work behind the scenes. Archaeologists, historians, and theologians examined ancient manuscripts, some freshly unearthed, others gathering dust for generations. They placed the canonical Gospels side by side with forgotten texts, studying every shift in emphasis and detail. Time after time they found evidence of a woman Jesus entrusted with his message, even when others questioned her testimony. This research seldom made it into church services, but it spread through documentaries, lecture halls, and digital platforms. For countless everyday believers, seeing Mary as a leader and teacher stopped feeling radical. It started feeling long overdue. Questions arose about whether the Vatican's hesitation stemmed from protecting genuine faith or merely preserving old customs. Throughout European cathedrals, her depiction stayed frozen in place, always on her knees, always weeping, always clutching that jar of ointment. But in discussions following services, in reading groups, and in the hushed corners of public libraries, another version of Mary was beginning to resurface, the bold, insightful, unflinching woman. The Vatican's secret archives, said to house endless rows of undisclosed materials, remained a source of endless curiosity. Might there be correspondence from early church figures debating her position? Could there be complete versions of Gospels presenting her as the apostles' peer? No one knew for certain, and maybe that was intentional. Still, history has its own momentum against locked gates. Each fresh finding, each scrap of ancient writing, each person brave enough to speak her name with proper respect, draws Mary Magdalene further into visibility. The Vatican might maintain its silence, but beyond those ancient walls her narrative is gradually reforming, like a portrait appearing through layers of accumulated grime. In the past few years, the Catholic Church has made modest yet meaningful gestures toward honouring Mary Magdalene more completely. Back in 2016, Pope Francis raised her memorial to feast day status, positioning her among the apostles in the Church's official calendar. The formal announcement named her the Apostle to the Apostles, an ancient title that had existed informally but never received such high-level recognition. Many viewed this as a subtle admission of her genuine importance. Still, the modification arrived without revising her standard biography. Homilies continued presenting her primarily as an example of penitence and dedication. The broader picture, the instructor, the authority, the first herald of resurrection, rarely found its way into regular parish teaching. The Vatican appeared prepared to acknowledge her formally, but not quite ready to welcome harder questions. Beyond ecclesiastical boundaries, the dialogue kept expanding. Scholars continued releasing research, analysing not just the recognised Gospels but also discoveries from locations like Nag Hammadi. They investigated how authority structures, cultural assumptions and gender politics might have shaped Christianity's recorded past. In these academic circles, Mary transformed from a marginal footnote into a commanding presence whose influence had been intentionally diminished across centuries. Travel to places associated with her life also grew. In the French region of Provence, where legend places her final years, travellers made the challenging climb to the grotto called La Sainte Baume. Surrounded by ancient rock and wavering candlelight, they sat in profound quiet, some seeking her spiritual aid, others simply contemplating her bravery. In the neighbouring community of Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume, her sacred remains rested in an ornate reliquary, attracting believers and skeptics alike. For those undertaking these pilgrimages, Mary transcended historical abstraction. She felt present in their worship, embodying both faithful conviction and the price of speaking truth. Perhaps that's what makes the Vatican still uncomfortable. Fully acknowledging her as historical evidence suggests would require admitting the Church's traditional account has been lacking. It would mean unlocking secured doors, not just in document repositories, but in the collective understanding of millions. Yet complete silence proves impossible. In creative works, in academic writing, in murmured devotions, and in enduring folk traditions that refuse to disappear, Mary Magdalene's voice keeps growing stronger. It remains firm, measured, and fearless. Eventually, it might ring out so powerfully that even the Vatican's most formidable barriers cannot silence it. When that moment arrives, people won't ask why she inspired fear, but why recognition took this long. The narrative still feels incomplete even today. Every breakthrough, every tentative move toward acknowledgement raises fresh questions instead of settling old ones. Deep in the Vatican's passages, under painted ceilings and beyond restricted access points, there might be manuscripts bearing her name in confident script, untouched by generations of doctrinal interpretation. Maybe these documents contain exchanges between her and the earliest followers, instances of instruction and debate, spiritual experiences and prayers that guided the first communities. If writings like these exist, making them public would do more than correct historical oversights. They might transform how countless people comprehend their faith's origins. Some would celebrate this as redemption, truth finally restored after centuries of neglect. Others might experience it as destabilizing, prompting concerns about why the complete story remained concealed so long. The Vatican has consistently maintained careful balance between honouring tradition and adapting to emerging understanding. Mary's account, rich with complexity and potential, occupies exactly that precarious space. Outside Rome's ancient boundaries, her influence continues gaining momentum. Contemporary faithful, creative minds and storytellers are reclaiming her legacy, merging the devoted witness described in Scripture with the teacher and leader portrayed in suppressed writings. Musical compositions celebrate her not as a reformed sinner, but as a bearer of insight. Visual artists depict her with clear gaze and welcoming gestures, not bent in humiliation but raised in power. Each year when her feast day comes, churches echo with her name spoken in liturgy. Worshippers kneel, flames dance on wicks, and solemn respect fills the sanctuary. Some pray seeking absolution, others wanting direction. But unknowingly perhaps, many also preserve the legacy of a woman whose narrative resists complete containment. History moves forward regardless of attempts to restrain it. The Egyptian desert surrendered the Gospel of Mary after lying hidden for over a millennium. It's not unreasonable to think that someday the Vatican's restricted collections might yield their own revelations. When that time comes, the world might finally encounter the Mary Magdalene who arrived at dawn at the vacant tomb, who spoke boldly when others stayed silent, and who delivered a proclamation still resonating through ages. For now, her account remains simultaneously visible and concealed, a strand woven through Christianity's vast historical fabric. Maybe that explains the Vatican's apprehension. Not because of who she was then, but because of what she represents now, evidence that truth, once declared, cannot be recalled, and that one woman's testimony can redirect faith's entire trajectory. During the deep hours after midnight, when St. Peter's Square stands deserted and lamplight stretches across ancient stones, the Vatican feels purpose-built for concealment. The magnificent basilica rises in stillness, its marble frigid, its gilding catching faint illumination. Somewhere past its public spaces, through monitored entrances and spiral stairs, exist the rooms where ages of documentation are preserved. Entry is rare, and complete knowledge of what's stored there rarer still. Among the innumerable records, some surely mention her. Perhaps inscribed by a second-century copyist's careful hand, or in the assertive lettering of a church leader grappling with questions of her legitimacy. These are the materials that never reach parish bulletins. They stay secured in cabinets identified by catalogue codes understood only by select archivists. Those who've laboured in these archives describe history as having almost tangible presence. The atmosphere is moisture-controlled, illumination precisely regulated, and quiet absolute except for the whisper of pages being examined. In such an environment, the past feels within reach. One can easily picture discovering correspondence where an early authority confesses to modifying her story, or a gospel fragment preserving her teachings now lost. But the Vatican doesn't rush such decisions. The Church has witnessed civilizations ascend and collapse, nations establish and dissolve, and throughout maintained its collections with unwavering deliberation. From its perspective, what's shared with believers must be not merely accurate but secure from misunderstanding, from controversy, from the kind of transformation that echoes across epochs. So Mary Magdalene remains simultaneously celebrated and constrained, celebrated in believers' prayers, in coloured glass windows, projecting her form onto cathedral floors, in the feast day now carrying her name. Held back in ways that keep the full truth of her story concealed from sight, preserved in the silence of those ancient corridors. Maybe someday a choice will be made to unlock a particular archive, to reveal a particular document, and to let her words be heard without editing or hesitation. Or maybe her narrative will surface gradually, fragment by fragment, brought forward not by official announcement, but by the relentless pull of history itself. Until then, she moves between illumination and obscurity, a presence both recognized and mysterious, dreaded and cherished. Her reality waiting like a flame, unignited in the most hidden chamber of the Vatican, below the streets of Rome. Deep beneath, past the rumble of cars and the steps of visitors, the catacombs extend into darkness. These old passages hold the burial sites of ancient Christians, their surfaces marked with dim, weathered paintings. Some display scenes recognizable from holy texts. The shepherd tending his flock, the fish, the bread, while others remain enigmatic. In particular alcoves, barely visible frescoes show a woman standing with men, her arm lifted as though instructing. Historians have long argued about who this woman could be. Some suggest she represents an allegorical figure, possibly embodying the church itself. Others think she might be Mary Magdalene, captured not in text, but in pigment by followers who understood her narrative more completely than future generations would permit. If this is accurate, then her legacy was not entirely forgotten, but concealed in plain view underground and beyond the reach of the authorized version. The Vatican maintains records of these ancient Christian locations carefully documented through decades of research, but the understanding of what is discovered there remains often guarded, moulded to align with the structure already established. An image that might be Mary could be marked simply as unidentified woman, its potential meaning quietly pushed aside. In this manner, history is maintained but not always permitted to express its complete truth. Still, the catacombs possess their own form of expression. The atmosphere is cold and motionless, and every footfall disturbs the sediment of ages. A subtle drop of moisture resonates from somewhere deep within the rock. In such quietness, it becomes easy to picture the murmurs of those who formerly assembled there, possibly breaking bread and sharing wine by lamplight, possibly recounting the narrative of a woman who had been the first to witness the risen Christ. Stories claim that some of these subterranean chambers were utilized for hidden worship when believers confronted persecution. If Mary's position was debated even in that era, the catacombs might have been locations where her legacy was sustained among those who valued her witness. Centuries afterward, the Vatican would assume custody of these chambers and their relics, becoming the guardian of not merely the faith's public history, but also its quiet, contested elements. And thus her existence persists here, underneath the face of the city and the mass of the basilicas overhead. Whether in deteriorating pigment, in unmarked writings, or in the undocumented recollections of those initial communities, Mary Magdalene's representation endures. It remains in the tranquility, a testament that the reality of history is not always destroyed. Sometimes it is merely interred, like a flame awaiting ignition, or a message awaiting the proper time to be heard once more. Distant from Rome, in the slopes of southern France, a separate segment of Mary Magdalene's narrative has existed for centuries, untouched by papal declarations or official church documentation. In the village of Saint Esmeris de la Mare, fishermen and visitors assemble annually to commemorate the landing of a small vessel said to have transported Mary, along with fellow travellers, across the Mediterranean following the crucifixion. The story claims she arrived without wealth or safeguards, led solely by conviction, and commenced a new existence in the harsh landscape of Provence. Journey further inland, and you discover the grotto of La Sainte Baume, elevated on a stone precipice and enclosed by woodland that appears ancient beyond measure. Visitors ascend the sharp incline, each stride resonating with the scraping of stones and the whisper of foliage, until they arrive at the shadowed entrance of the grotto. Within, the atmosphere is frigid and humid, carrying faint traces of mineral and melted wax. Here, custom maintains Mary resided in contemplation and isolation for 3 decades, her presence merging with the breeze that moves through the gorge beneath. The Vatican does not deny her time in the area completely, but it addresses these stories with measured caution. Formal declarations emphasize her devotion and contrition, instead of the notion that she could have maintained a guiding position in displacement. Still, for those who visit here, the grotto represents more than a sacred site. It is a location where her existence feels near enough to grasp candles shimmer along the mineral surfaces. And in the hush, observers can nearly sense the cadence of soft supplications that could have formerly occupied the chamber. In the adjacent village of Saint-Maximin, La Sainte Baume, a basilica contains what are purported to be her remains, skeletal fragments preserved in a golden container watched over through centuries by religious brothers. The church presents them on her commemoration day, and devoted followers arrive from throughout the globe to prostrate before them. Whether or not the remains are genuinely hers remains a matter that history might never resolve. but the reverence they generate is unmistakable. For the Vatican, such locations present a careful equilibrium. They are influential centres of devotion, attracting visitors who strengthen their bond to the Church. Yet they also maintain narratives that the official documentation does not completely accept. The Mary Magdalene of Provence is not the subdued penitent of medieval artwork, but a wanderer, someone who persevered, a spiritual leader whose impact extended far past Jerusalem. Here, in the dim grotto and the golden container, the boundaries between documented events and folklore become indistinct, and perhaps it is within this indistinctness that her most genuine representation exists, not entirely under the Church's authority, nor entirely separate from it, but shifting between the two, much like the woman herself formerly shifted between illumination and obscurity. Throughout France, the recollection of Mary Magdalene does not rest with a single location. In medieval periods, villages discreetly vied for the distinction of possessing her remains. Each maintained its own narrative, its own consecrated receptacle, its own ceremony through confined passages. Visitors journeyed from sacred place to sacred place, receiving varied accounts in each location. Some claimed her physical form had been interred in one sanctuary, then concealed during periods of peril. Others insisted her skeletal fragments had been transported over ridges to maintain their security. The Vatican, observing from a distance, seldom resolved these conflicts. Formal acknowledgement of one location above another might separate communities or contest long-established customs. Rather, the Church permitted these competing shrines to coexist alongside one another, each maintaining its own beacon of devotion burning. For devoted followers, the matter of genuineness was frequently less significant than the experience of pilgrimage itself. To traverse the paths she was thought to have travelled, to genuflect before a container claimed to preserve her skeletal remains, was to approach her in essence. Regardless of what historical accuracy might suggest in the villages, observances developed around these customs. Church bells sounded from mineral towers, vendor stalls brimmed with grain products and fermented grape beverages, and the passages filled with the resonance of devotions mingled with merriment. The inhabitants remembered her not as a representation in coloured cathedral glass, but as someone who had journeyed through tempests and banishment, someone whose conviction had withstood every ordeal. Yet there was also something implicit in these commemorations, an underlying sense that possibly here, distant from the influence of Rome, Mary's recollection was less constrained. She could be venerated as a sanctified figure without her narrative being adjusted to accommodate a solitary sanctioned interpretation. In the melodies performed at nightfall by firelight, she could still be the instructor who consoled the apostles, the messenger who delivered the initial report of the resurrection, the individual who ventured to remain where others had retreated. The Vatican might not have dreaded these observances outright, but it grasped their subtle influence. A sanctified figure, remembered in this manner, is not merely an emblem of devotion, but also a testament to history that cannot be entirely commanded. And thus, while the Church blessed the visitors and accepted their contributions, it never completely adopted the more profound narratives that existed in these villages. Even presently, wanderers can position themselves in the plazas of these settlements and sense the burden of ages in the atmosphere. The stone pavement has been rendered smooth by the passage of innumerable visitors, each bearing their own motivation for arriving. And in the soft resonance of the church bells, one can nearly detect her identity moving through the eras, not in the expression of power, but in the expression of the inhabitants who have never ceased relating her narrative. In the Middle Ages, another dimension was incorporated into her story, one that connected her to one of the most persistent enigmas of all history, the Holy Grail. In the courts of France, verse-makers and tale-spinners began incorporating her identity into accounts of the consecrated vessel said to have contained the blood of Christ. Some suggested that she had transported it with her from Jerusalem, safeguarding it as she travelled into banishment. Others maintained that the Grail was not a physical item at all, but an emblem of the sacred understanding she protected, understanding too profound to be confined to the Church's authority structure alone. The Vatican never validated such accounts, but neither could it completely eliminate them. They move not through formal teachings, but through melody, verse, and the subtle retellings around domestic fires. In these interpretations, Mary was more than a disciple. She was the guardian of something concealed that could transform how the world comprehended the purpose of Jesus. Whether the Grail was an artifact or a concept, it positioned her at the core of an enigma that extended across both documented events and conviction. Warriors returning from the Crusades transported these accounts into the courts of Europe, incorporating their own embellishments. Some claimed they had witnessed symbols in eastern lands that suggested her travels. Others mentioned hidden protectors who still defended the Grail and the reality it contained. The Church permitted the Grail stories to persist as accounts of nobility and devotion, but refrained from associating them too directly to Mary. To accomplish so would risk reviving the concept of her as a guide in her own capacity. In Renaissance artwork, emblems of the Grail sometimes emerged subtly. A vessel positioned on a surface near her, a delicate crimson blossom beside her palm. To those who understood the stories, these were suggestions, almost like encrypted communications. To others, they were merely ornamental elements. This subtle fusion of visual art and enigma permitted her association to the Grail to persist without drawing the complete force of church examination. Presently, the connection between Mary Magdalene and the Holy Grail remains one of the most fascinating elements in her narrative. It attracts wanderers to ancient sanctuaries, motivates written works and motion pictures, and encourages boundless conjecture. For some, it is absolute folklore. For others, it is a reality interred too profoundly to demonstrate. If the Vatican does possess documentation that addresses such an association, they remain secured away, as protected as the Grail itself is claimed to be. And perhaps that is portion of the explanation the story persists, because no matter how many centuries elapse, the unanswered matter still awakens the mind. Was Mary Magdalene merely an observer, or was she the protector of something so influential that even now the Church cannot manage to articulate it? Through the Renaissance and into the period of the Inquisition, the elements of Mary Magdalene's alternative narrative were sustained only in cautious murmurs. In those centuries, expressing openly of convictions outside the authorized teachings could invite doubt, prosecution, and even execution. The Inquisition's influence was extensive, and its presence loomed over anyone who ventured to challenge the power of the Church or propose that the faith's beginnings might contain more perspectives than those formally acknowledged. For those who revered Mary as more than a penitent, this was a perilous period. The Gnostic documents that assigned her a principal position had long been proclaimed heretical, and anyone discovered duplicating or studying them faced severe consequences. Still, in secluded areas of Europe, some households transmitted portions of her narrative as component of their own personal conviction. These were not magnificent declarations, but subtle demonstrations of recollection. An identity incorporated in a supplication, an emblem etched into timber, a narrative shared by candlelight to a reliable audience. The Vatican, in its position as protector of orthodoxy, regarded such customs with doubt. The concept of Mary as an instructor and spiritual power outside the framework of the priesthood presented a challenge to the system the Church had constructed over centuries. And thus, even while her representation decorated sanctuaries and her commemoration was observed, the more profound dimensions of her narrative were subtly discouraged, if not entirely eliminated. In visual art from the period, she frequently emerged in positions of anguish, grasping a cranium or directing her vision upward in contrition. Seldom was she displayed in the demonstration of instructing or positioned among the apostles as a peer. This transformation in representation functioned as a silent instruction to devoted followers, forming how eras comprehended her position. Yet history is seldom eliminated entirely. In the collections of monasteries, in the sheets of prohibited volumes, and in the recollections of modest communities, traces of another Mary persisted. Some of these remnants have emerged in contemporary periods, located in personal collections or long-abandoned storage chambers. Others might still remain concealed, anticipating a moment when it is secure to be observed. For those who examine the intersection of conviction and documented events, the Inquisition years are a critical juncture, a period when the Church's apprehension of separation was sufficient enough to enter not merely concepts, but also the recollection of a woman who formerly stood at the core of the Christian narrative. And perhaps that is the most profound enigma of all, that even in an era when quietness was imposed by power, Mary Magdalene's existence could not be entirely eliminated. Somewhere, even in the most shadowed years, her identity still remained in the subtle supplications of those who remembered. By the period the Inquisition's influence began to diminish, the Vatican had securely established its principal power. The centuries of command had formed the account so thoroughly that for most followers, the representation of Mary Magdalene as a penitent transgressor was all they had ever understood. Yet underneath the facade, the challenge she represented to the established system had not disappeared. The Church's framework depended on a distinct authority structure, with the priesthood as the connection between devoted followers and the sacred. Mary's narrative, in its more complete form, implied something alternative, that a woman without formal consecration could be assigned with the most significant communication in Christian history. Her observation at the vacant burial place, her comprehension of the teachings and the consideration she appeared to possess among the disciples suggested a pattern of guidance that did not depend on the formal pathways the Church had established. This is the reason, even after the danger of heresy prosecutions had subsided, her position remained minimized. The Vatican comprehended that concepts can be as disruptive as demonstrations, and that reintroducing the representation of Mary as a guide could provoke inquiries about the position of women in the Church. For centuries, custom had maintained these positions restricted, and any challenge to that limitation would need to be addressed with extreme carefulness. In teachings and devotional compositions, she continued to be commended for her dedication, her contrition, and her steadfastness. These characteristics were secure, accommodating neatly into the structure the Church desired to maintain. What remained unmentioned was that dedication and guidance are not distinct elements, and that her steadfastness might have been the precise explanation she was selected to deliver the initial report of the resurrection. For the Vatican, the apprehension was not that followers would cease honouring her, but that they might commence to honour her in a different manner as a pattern for spiritual power outside the priesthood. Such a transformation could unlock the entrance to broader discussions about who might guide, instruct, and articulate in the designation of the Church. And thus the formal quietness persisted, yet outside the barriers of Rome, the ancient inquiries were never entirely absent. In monasteries, in subtle theological circles, and in the productions of independent researchers, the discussion over her genuine position continued. Even without entry to concealed collections, the indications were there in the Gospels, in the apocryphal compositions, in the visual art that resisted the sanctioned representation. Mary Magdalene's narrative had persisted through the Inquisition, the reconstruction of her representation and centuries of selective recollection. The challenge she presented was not in history, it existed onward, not in defiance, but in the straightforward, persistent reality that her existence in the earliest days of the conviction could not be rationalized away. It was a reality the Vatican could restrain, but never eliminate. When the Reformation moved across Europe in the 16th century, it disturbed the foundations of the Catholic Church in manners not witnessed for centuries. Reformers contested papal power, interrogated long-maintained customs, and summoned for a restoration to Scripture as the principal reference for conviction. In this fresh surge of discussion, Mary Magdalene's narrative emerged once more, though in varied and often contradictory manners. Some Protestant intellectuals rejected many of the medieval stories about her completely, removing the dimensions of custom and concentrating on what was discovered in the Bible. In accomplishing so, they eliminated the representation of her as a prostitute, a position that had never been validated by Scripture, and instead highlighted her as a dedicated disciple of Jesus and the initial observer to his resurrection. For these reformers, she was a representation of conviction and bravery, though they seldom assigned her a station of guidance past that instant at the burial place. Others, however, recognized in her an emblem of the form of immediate relationship with God that the Reformation promoted. If Mary could perceive the expression of the risen Christ and be dispatched to inform the apostles, then possibly no elaborate authority structure was required to position between the follower and the sacred. This concept, though attractive to some, was still too extreme for most guides, even outside the Catholic Church, for it proposed that women might possess spiritual power equivalent to men. In Rome, the Vatican confronted greater challenges from the Reformation than from renewed attention in Mary's genuine position. Still, her narrative remained tightly within the parameters it had established centuries earlier. The Council of Trent, assembling between 1545 and 1563, reaffirmed Catholic teachings and customs, incorporating the representation of Mary Magdalene as a pattern of contrition. Any concept of her as a guide or instructor passed that was subtly positioned aside. Yet the Reformation's impact could not be completely restrained. The printing apparatus distributed fresh concepts faster than the Vatican could respond. Bibles were rendered into regional languages, and common inhabitants could study the gospel narratives for themselves. Some detected the elements that had long been disregarded, that Mary was existing when others had retreated, that she was assigned with the initial declaration of the resurrection. Even without direct confrontation, this subtle recognition began to expand throughout both Catholic and Protestant territories. A modest but consistent flow of followers started to perceive Mary in a different illumination. She was not merely a representation in a coloured cathedral glass opening, but an observer whose position maintained implications for the framework of the Church itself. The Vatican, observing the current of religious transformation, maintained securely to its selected account. But the Reformation had planted a beginning, a testament that Scripture could articulate for itself, and that Mary Magdalene's expression was still there, anticipating to be perceived. By the 19th century, Europe was transforming in manners the Vatican could not disregard. Industry reconstructed cities, uprisings contested monarchies, and fresh movements in visual art and literature began to examine history with different perspectives. In this shifting realm, Mary Magdalene reappeared in artworks, verse, and written works, not always in the representation the Church had maintained, but in forms moulded by the creativity of a different era. Romantic authors recognized her as an emblem of profound, lasting affection, a representation who had confronted sorrow and banishment with steadfast dedication. Visual artists portrayed her not merely in anguish, but in instances of subtle strength, directing her vision toward a boundary that appeared to guarantee liberation. These representations were not confined by medieval penitence. They permitted her to position as a woman of brave resilience and enigma. The Vatican regarded such productions with courteous separation. Formally, Mary remained the contrite disciple, her magnificence discovered in her modesty and assistance, but the public was progressively attracted to other dimensions of her narrative, her proximity to Jesus, her station at the resurrection, and the concept that she might have maintained teachings that had never been completely disclosed. Pilgrimages to her sacred sites acquired fresh vitality throughout this period. Enhanced transportation meant that more inhabitants could arrive at the Basilica at Saint-Maximin, La Sainte-Baume, or ascend the incline to the Grotto of La Sainte-Baume. Observers brought with them not merely supplications but also inquisitiveness. Some arrived seeking miracles, others seeking documented events. and many departed with a sensation that they had contacted something more ancient and more profound than the Church's formal narrative. At the same period, historians began analysing ancient manuscripts with a more analytical perspective. Attention in ancient Christian documents expanded, and revelations in the deserts of Egypt and the collections of Europe disclosed compositions that had been forgotten for centuries. The Gospel of Mary, long concealed from observation, began to attract consideration among researchers. Though fragmentary, it presented a perspective that felt personal, straightforward, and unlike anything in the New Testament. For the Vatican, the 19th century was a period to safeguard custom amid rapid transformation. The Church did not directly contest the expanding attention in Mary Magdalene's alternative narrative, but neither did it promote it. Quietness became a form of protection, permitting dedication to persist, while maintaining inquiries at a separation. Yet outside those protected barriers, her representation was developing again. The Mary Magdalene of the 19th century was no longer restricted to one position. She was sanctified observer, banished wanderer and inspiration, a representation who belonged as much to visual art and civilization as to the sheets of scripture. And with each fresh representation, the ancient parameters around her narrative expanded just slightly thinner. The 20th century brought revelations that would transform the manner the realm thought about ancient Christianity. In 1945, near the Egyptian settlement of Nag Hammadi, a cultivator excavating for fertilizer encountered a sealed container interred in the ground. Within were ancient papyrus manuscripts maintained for more than 1,500 years. Among them were Gnostic documents that articulated in perspectives long quieted, and among those perspectives, resonances of Mary Magdalene could be perceived. Researchers working to render and examine these documents discovered compositions that proposed a more intricate and varied ancient church than many had pictured. Some of the manuscripts represented Mary as a valued confidant of Jesus, a disciple who comprehended his teachings in manners others did not. The Gospel of Mary, already recognized in portion from earlier revelations, now positioned alongside these other compositions, forming a pattern of conviction that was abundant, mystical, and often at variance with formal doctrine. For those captivated by the concealed areas of Christian history, these discoveries were a disclosure. They suggested at discussions, disagreements, and competing understandings that had moulded the conviction in its earliest years. They also strengthened the notion that Mary had been far more than a peripheral character, that she may have been a leader whose significance was later reduced to align with the framework the Church sought to maintain. The Vatican's response to the Nag Hammadi findings was measured. It didn't dispute their existence or block scholars from examining them. However, it didn't hurry to weave their revelations into official doctrine either. Some church officials rejected the Gnostic writings as heretical or dubious, arguing that they'd been left out of the canon with sound reasoning. Others recognized their historical significance but called for caution when interpreting them. Beyond church boundaries, the impact was considerably stronger. Publications, presentations, and scholarly gatherings introduced Mary Magdalene's name into mainstream discourse in fresh ways. She was no longer merely the repentant holy figure of medieval stories. She was someone whose narrative appeared to have been moulded as much by politics and authority as by devotion. In creative works, writing and cinema, this revised understanding took hold. Mary evolved into a representation of knowledge that endures despite attempts to silence it, a signal that history may contain truths still waiting to emerge. Devotees kept travelling to her sacred sites, but now some came with different inquiries, questioning how much of her account stayed concealed in the Vatican's protected archives. When the 20th century ended, Mary Magdalene was once more at the heart of a widespread, quiet intrigue. The Nag Hammadi revelations hadn't altered the Church's narrative, but they'd created an opening that couldn't simply be shut. And through that opening, the puzzle of why the Vatican had been wary of her continued to persist, as captivating as always. The 20th century delivered findings that would transform how people understood early Christianity. In 1945, close to the Egyptian village of Nag Hammadi, a farmer searching for fertilizer discovered a sealed container buried underground. Within it were ancient papyrus documents preserved for over 1,500 years. Among them were Gnostic writings that spoke with voices long suppressed. And within those voices, traces of Mary Magdalene could be detected. Researchers working to decipher and analyse these writings found documents that indicated a more intricate and varied early church than many had envisioned. Some of the manuscripts depicted Mary as a close confidant of Jesus, a follower who grasped his messages in ways others couldn't. The Gospel of Mary, previously known partially from earlier finds, now existed alongside these other documents, creating a pattern of faith that was profound, spiritual, and frequently conflicted with established teaching. For those captivated by the obscure aspects of Christian history, these discoveries were transformative. They suggested at disputes, conflicts, and competing understandings that had influenced the faith in its beginning years. They also strengthened the notion that Mary had been far more than a peripheral character, that she may have been a leader whose significance was later reduced to align with the framework the Church sought to maintain. The Vatican's response to the Nag Hammadi findings was measured. It didn't dispute their existence or block scholars from examining them. However, it didn't hurry to weave their revelations into official doctrine either. Some church officials rejected the Gnostic writings as heretical or dubious, arguing that they'd been left out of the canon with sound reasoning. Others recognized their historical significance but called for caution when interpreting them. Beyond church boundaries, the impact was considerably stronger. Publications, presentations, and scholarly gatherings introduced Mary Magdalene's name into mainstream discourse in fresh ways. She was no longer merely the repentant, holy figure of medieval stories. She was someone whose narrative appeared to have been moulded as much by politics and authority as by devotion. In creative works, writing and cinema, this revised understanding took hold. Mary evolved into a representation of knowledge that endures despite attempts to silence it, a signal that history may contain truths still waiting to emerge. Devotees kept travelling to her sacred sites, but now some came with different inquiries, questioning how much of her account stayed concealed in the Vatican's protected archives. When the 20th century ended, Mary Magdalene was once more at the heart of a widespread quiet intrigue. The Nag Hammadi revelations hadn't altered the Church's narrative, but they'd created an opening that couldn't simply be shut. And through that opening, the puzzle of why the Vatican had been wary of her continued to persist. As captivating as always. The opening years of the 21st century delivered a surge of mainstream awareness, unlike anything Mary Magdalene's account had experienced previously. In 2003, Dan Brown's book The Da Vinci Code became an international phenomenon, and shortly thereafter, the movie version reached countless more people. The story intertwined elements of history, mythology and theory, portraying Mary not as a penitent wrongdoer, but as a crucial figure in Jesus' life, and even as the guardian of a sacred lineage. The Vatican reacted swiftly and decisively, cautioning believers not to accept the book's assertions as fact. Church representatives labelled it entertainment, which it certainly was. Still, the narrative resonated with audiences across different cultures and perspectives. It rekindled inquiries that academics had been privately exploring for years. And it introduced those inquiries into homes, gathering places, and educational settings worldwide. For numerous people, the Da Vinci Code was their initial exposure to the Gospel of Mary, or the concept that early Christian history might be more layered than the interpretation presented in official teachings. The book didn't have to validate its claims. It simply had to imply that something was concealed, something deserving investigation. And through that approach, it injected fresh momentum into an already expanding movement of interest. The Vatican's predicament was complex. To disregard the mainstream fascination risked allowing conjecture to spread without limits. To confront it too openly risked generating even greater focus on concepts the Church didn't endorse. And therefore, while corrections were issued to address historical errors, the broader discussion about Mary's position stayed mostly unaddressed in official communications. Meanwhile, the travel sector in locations connected to Mary Magdalene experienced growth. Devotees and sightseers both flocked to Provence, Jerusalem, and Magdala in Galilee, motivated by a combination of faith, interest, and the appeal of an enigma spanning 2 millennia. In these destinations, tour leaders shared the conventional accounts, but also alluded to the alternative interpretations, allowing guests to determine for themselves which seemed more authentic. In university environments, the increase in mainstream attention gave academics more platforms to examine the Gnostic writings and early church dynamics. Symposiums filled with explorations about women in early Christianity, the formation of the New Testament collection, and the social influences that had affected Mary's portrayal. Although the Church's formal stance didn't shift, the 21st century had started with a clear transformation. Mary Magdalene was no longer a subdued figure in the margins of Christian history. She was a name people recognized, a narrative. They argued over a mystery they sought to solve. And in every unresolved mystery, the Vatican's ancient apprehension still resonated, not apprehension of Mary herself, but of the implications her complete account might trigger. As the surge of mainstream fascination from the Da Vinci Code started to subside, academics, writers, and faithful continued the dialogue in less dramatic but more enduring ways. College courses on early Christianity started, incorporating entire modules on Mary Magdalene, not merely as a scriptural character but as an examination of how history gets recorded by those in authority. Television programs appeared on prominent channels, combining scholar commentary with footage from the Holy Land, southern France, and the Vatican itself. In Catholic instruction, her portrayal started to evolve and broaden, though cautiously. In 2016, Pope Francis upgraded her liturgical observance to match that of the Apostles, formally designating her apostle to the Apostles in the Church schedule. For some, this represented a delayed acknowledgement of her position in the Gospel narratives. For others, it remained insufficient in recognizing her as a leader in the earliest Christian fellowship. The Vatican's phrasing was significant. The designation confirmed her importance without creating opportunities for wider discussions about women in authority. It honored her as a witness while maintaining the hierarchy of power intact. In a sense, it served as both recognition and limitation simultaneously. Meanwhile, recent archaeological work in Magdala, her birthplace on the Sea of Galilee, started to provide insights into the environment she would have experienced. Remains of a first-century temple, dwellings and commercial areas gave researchers a fuller understanding of everyday existence in her era. Walking through those unearthed passages, some guests remarked, it became simpler to picture her not as a remote holy figure, but as a real woman who moved, communicated, and laboured among her community before history converted her into a representation. Contemporary religious thinkers also started reassessing the early conflicts between Mary and Peter in non-canonical documents. These sections, where Peter challenges her authority, gained fresh significance in current conversations about the position of women in religious service. Some interpreted them as historical echoes of disputes that still influence the Church presently. Beyond religious communities, Mary Magdalene kept inspiring books, movies, and artistic creations. Some remained faithful to Scripture, others embraced mythology, and still others merged both approaches. Each fresh interpretation contributed to her changing portrayal, guaranteeing that she stayed a subject of fascination not only for believers but for anyone attracted to the mystery of a narrative, partially revealed and partially obscured. And therefore, in the 21st century, the Vatican remains in a recognizable situation, protecting convention while the world outside its boundaries keeps envisioning what could be accurate. The apprehension may not be as intense as in previous centuries, but it persists subdued and vigilant, like a secured entrance in an extended corridor, restraining a narrative that refuses to disappear. For numerous people within and beyond the Church, the inquiry of why the Vatican was apprehensive of Mary Magdalene has transformed from a question of history to one of potential. In private discussions among religious leaders, scholars and church members, her name frequently surfaces. When exploring the future position of women in religious service, she represents both foundation and obstacle. Foundation because the Gospels position her at the core of the most significant event in Christian belief, and an obstacle because accepting the complete significance of that foundation could disturb conventions that have existed for almost 2 millennia. In some congregations, her commemoration day is observed with messages that address more directly her bravery and authority. In others, she's still described in identical language as in earlier centuries, with focus on dedication and modesty. This inconsistent acknowledgement reflects the broader Church itself, where some perspectives advocate for broadening women's positions, while others maintain that such modifications would contradict apostolic convention. The Vatican, as always, navigates a delicate balance. Its declarations about Mary Magdalene are gracious, respectful, and abundant with commendation, yet they stay deliberately contained within the limits of its doctrinal authority. There's an openness to celebrate her, but not to allow her narrative to establish a foundation that could create opportunities for ordination or equivalent authority. For women, this represents the conflict, an inclination to honour without yielding. Among the faithful, nevertheless, her portrayal keeps expanding beyond those restrictions. In discussion circles, in journeys to Provence or Magdala, and in academic environments, her narrative is investigated with a freedom that doesn't always exist in formal contexts. People examine the non-canonical Gospels, contemplate the social and political dynamics that influenced early Christianity, and ponder what it might signify if her perspective had been granted equal standing with Peter's. This persistent interest is possibly the Vatican's most subdued worry. For centuries, management of the account helped manage the faith's organization. But in an era of worldwide communication, where documents can be accessed digitally and discussions can occur across continents instantly, the previous suppressions are more difficult to preserve. Mary Magdalene's narrative, once regulated through exclusion, now circulates freely through publications, movies, audio programs, and religious journeys. And therefore the apprehension persists, not as a direct confrontation, but as a continuing inquiry. What occurs if the faithful embrace an interpretation of Mary that contests the very basis of the Church's structure? The outcome is unclear, but the potential is present. And that potential may be the precise thing the Vatican has attempted to protect against for centuries. Some within the contemporary Church view Mary Magdalene not as a danger, but as a connection. They envision her as a character who could link convention with transformation, providing a method to respect the past while addressing the present. Her bravery at the burial site, her faithfulness in the presence of danger, and her position as the initial bearer of the resurrection message are characteristics that rise above discussions over structure. These are the qualities that can be emphasized without modifying the organization of the Church. Yet they also possess the capacity to encourage deeper inquiries. In meetings where church members and religious leaders gather for candid exchange, her name is occasionally mentioned with a sense of optimism. If she could be acknowledged completely not only for her dedication but for her guidance, it might promote a refreshed understanding of what following means for all believers. In this regard, she could assist in bridging separations rather than widening them. Yet the Vatican understands that acknowledgement is not a straightforward issue. To reinstate Mary Magdalene's guidance to its proper position in history would require more than a modification in terminology. It would demand a re-evaluation of the Church's conception of power itself. For an organization established on centuries of precise structure, such transformation carries uncertain consequences. The concept of Mary as a connection is attractive precisely because it implies evolution without collapse. She could function as a representation of persistence, demonstrating that the earliest Christian testimony incorporated women at the very heart of the account. This wouldn't eliminate convention, but rather enhance it by recognizing realities that have long remained in obscurity. Still, the choice belongs with those who protect the Church's instruction. For the moment, the Vatican provides careful commendation, maintaining her within the secure parameters of dedication while avoiding the broader ramifications of her position. In the interim, outside its boundaries, her narrative keeps growing in the consciousness and understanding of the faithful, academics and inquirers alike. Perhaps eventually she will truly become that connection, not merely between history and present, but between what has been recalled and what has been overlooked. If that moment arrives, it won't be because the Vatican abandoned its apprehension entirely, but because it decided to believe that the reality she delivered from the vacant burial site was never intended to be restricted. Like the Vatican's own stratified construction, Mary Magdalene's narrative is constructed in phases, each period contributing its own foundation, its own decoration, its own barriers to protect what exists inside. From the confined passages of historical Magdala to the illuminated chambers of medieval Europe. From Renaissance artwork to contemporary scholarship, her portrayal has been formed and reformed until only pieces of the original stay apparent. Moving through the Vatican, one can observe how history itself is managed. Underneath the impressive cathedrals exist earlier structures, and underneath those the fragments of Roman residences and pre-Christian sanctuaries. Each stratum conceals another, and yet each still depends upon the base below. Mary's narrative feels identical, the apparent portion resting above deeper realities, some of which have been purposefully enclosed. In this regard, the Vatican's association with her is not merely one of censorship, but of deliberate preservation, at least from its own viewpoint. By presenting her in a particular manner, the Church maintains it is safeguarding cohesion and defending the faith. Yet for others, these strata are obstacles obscuring a more comprehensive and possibly more troubling reality. Guests to Rome frequently move through the Vatican museums without realizing that there are chambers few will ever access, shelves containing manuscripts too delicate or too problematic to be displayed. It's simple to imagine that somewhere within these protected collections exists a record, a correspondence, or a gospel that could alter the way we comprehend Mary Magdalene's position. The notion is both fascinating and exasperating, that solutions may exist, but stay secured, possibly for motives as ancient as the Church itself. And yet, as with the strata of foundation underneath St. Peter's Basilica, time has a method of exposing what has been concealed. Barriers fracture, surfaces move, and occasionally a small gap emerges, permitting illumination into a space that has long existed in obscurity. Mary's narrative may eventually discover such a gap. Until that moment, it exists in the conflict between what is understood and what is retained. Between the narratives shared from platforms and the murmurs that travel through subdued passages like the Vatican's historical foundations, the reality is present, whether or not it is revealed to light. Some envision a solitary record keeper moving through those subdued Vatican passages late at night, the sound of steps on smooth stone. In this scenario, the record keeper holds a small collection of keys, each one made smooth by years of handling, each corresponding to an entrance that protects something valuable. At the conclusion of a slim corridor, there is a storage unit marked with a single character, M. It is secured, its material aged with time, its fasteners quiet from extended neglect. What exists inside is uncertain. Perhaps it is merely a set of medieval sermons or devotional texts, or perhaps it holds something far more ancient. A complete version of the Gospel of Mary, intact and unaltered, or a correspondence from an early religious leader describing her position in language the world has never encountered. The record keeper pauses a moment, hand resting on the cool metal handle, then continues forward, the storage unit staying closed, the key untouched. Such a scenario captures the lasting conflict of Mary Magdalene's narrative. Whether or not such a storage unit genuinely exists, the notion that it could is sufficient to awaken the imagination. It addresses the understanding that history is not only what is documented, but also what is retained. The Vatican, with its centuries of guardianship, is a location where both categories of history, the disclosed and the concealed, exist together simultaneously. And possibly this is the genuine reason the enigma continues. It is not exclusively about one woman's position in the beginning days of Christianity. It is about the method organizations select which realities to reveal and which to protect in quietness. It is about the recognition that sometimes maintaining a narrative secured is not an action of neglect, but of intentional selection. In this manner, the secured storage unit becomes a representation. It prompts us that even if Mary Magdalene's complete narrative stays enclosed, the inquiries it generates cannot be secured. They travel quietly through time, transferred from academic to devotee, from narrator to audience, anticipating the instant when the appropriate key is discovered, or when the fastener is merely no longer sufficient to restrain. In the subdued passages of the Gospel of Philip, there is one instance that seems to attract more focus than any other. It describes how Jesus cherished Mary more than the other followers, and how he would frequently embrace her. The writing does not clarify the significance of this gesture, nor does it assign it the emotional significance some contemporary authors envision. In the terminology of the period, an embrace could be a greeting, a blessing, or an indication of mutual understanding. But what holds most significance is how the other followers responded to it. According to the section, they questioned Jesus about it. Why did he demonstrate such affection toward her? Why did he reveal things with her that they had not received in their inquiries? You can almost sense the strain. It is not merely interest, but unease. In a collective where guidance and confidence were paramount, Mary's proximity to Jesus was something they couldn't disregard. This proximity may have been about more than companionship. The Gospel of Philip frequently addresses spiritual union, a connection between the consciousness and sacred reality. Some maintain Mary was perceived as a reflection of this connection, not merely for herself, but as an example for all believers. If that was accurate, her position was not only individual, but profoundly meaningful. She became a link between the mortal and the sacred, a tangible demonstration of the evolution the Gospel describes. For the early church, this could be motivating, but for authorities who would subsequently establish doctrine and power, it might have been troubling. If sacred reality could be accessed directly without moving through the hierarchies of officials and clergy, then the necessity for those hierarchies would be contested, and if a woman could represent that reality, the positions of women in the faith would need to be reconsidered completely. Over the centuries, the Church decided not to preserve the Gospel of Philip among its holy writings. The explanations were probably numerous, but it is difficult not to observe that excluding it also excluded the most vivid depiction of Mary Magdalene as a spiritual counterpart to the apostles. Without it, her narrative could be presented differently, moulded to match a design that rendered her less of a leader and more of a supporter. When the Nag Hammadi collection was revealed in 1945, it was as if perspectives long interred had started to communicate again. The Gospel of Philip was one of those perspectives, subtle, but still distinct enough to transform how we consider the past. In its language, Mary's existence is powerful, her comprehension profound, and her bond to Jesus unwavering. And possibly in the subdued chambers of the Vatican, that depiction is still the one that remains, both magnificent and threatening at the same time. The expression "the companion of the Saviour" has generated endless discussion among historians, religious scholars, and inquisitive minds alike. It is a straightforward passage, yet it creates an entrance to inquiries that have no simple solutions. In the historical world, language carried multiple dimensions of significance. A companion could be someone who travelled beside you, who participated in your purpose, or who understood your essence in ways others couldn't. In the Gospel of Philip, the designation seems to indicate a proximity that was spiritual above anything else, a connection of confidence and mutual comprehension. If Mary Magdalene was truly this companion, it would signify she was more than merely a supporter who observed events. She would have been a collaborator in instruction, someone who could communicate with credibility about the language and significance of Jesus' message. In the years following his death, such a position could hold tremendous influence. That influence, however, wouldn't integrate easily into a hierarchy that subsequently positioned guidance in the control of men exclusively. This is where the Gospel of Philip becomes more than merely an historical writing. It is a perspective into an early Christianity that had not yet established into the form we recognise presently. In that period, concepts circulated freely between communities. There were discussions about the character of God, the significance of salvation, and the position of those who transmitted the message. In such an atmosphere, a character like Mary could exist at the heart of the dialogue. But as the Church expanded and pursued cohesion, perspectives that didn't correspond with the selected direction started to diminish. The removal of the Gospel of Philip from the Church's accepted scripture was not an event marked by public statements. It transpired silently, a gradual process in which specific documents were copied and widely circulated, while others simply faded from use. As time went on, those overlooked texts became increasingly scarce, their influence lessening until they existed only as obscure references in aged libraries or damaged remnants unearthed from the desert. And yet, the fact that even fragments of this gospel survived ensures that the representation of Mary within its pages cannot be completely forgotten. In these writings, she's not merely a bystander standing on the periphery of the crowd, but the one who receives profound instruction directly from Jesus. She is presented as the one whom the other disciples question and perhaps even regard with a measure of jealousy. This depiction of Mary is a figure more challenging to contain, harder to simplify into the role of a repentant sinner for the official church structure. Acknowledging this dimension of her narrative could provoke a cascade of inquiries concerning the origins of Christianity, the structure of its leadership, and the role of women in spiritual practice. It might necessitate opening long-sealed repositories, both literally and figuratively, to reveal the extent to which the historical record was shaped by deliberate choices rather than by accident. That, arguably, is the underlying reason why the Gospel of Philip remains a subject of scholarly interest, though it is not part of the liturgical tradition. Its perspective persists, but it speaks from the fringes, just as Mary herself has for nearly 2 millennia. In the subtle illumination of a flame, the language of the Gospel of Philip takes on a character that feels like a recollection. Its contents are not presented as declarations of law or definitive mandates. Instead, they flow like pieces of a dialogue, suggesting they were recorded by someone who overheard them in a private setting. Within these lines, Mary Magdalene is not a remote mythical character, but a tangible person who is present, listening attentively, posing questions, and reaching a deep understanding. The nature of Jesus' address to her is notably different. It carries a sense of innate recognition, as if he perceives in her a mind and spirit uniquely prepared to grasp ideas that others were not yet ready for. This feeling of trust is what makes the document so powerful. It implies that true spiritual insight is not restricted to those holding formal titles or positions. Rather, it is available to those prepared to receive it, regardless of their societal standing or gender. In the formalized structure that the Church would later establish, this fundamental concept could be disruptive. Leadership in that era depended on clearly defined channels of authority, and the notion that someone outside that hierarchy could possess such deep knowledge presented a direct challenge. The other followers in the Gospel appear to sense this tension. Their queries regarding Mary's close relationship are not merely about affection. They are questions of access. If Jesus shared things with her that he withheld from them, what did that signify for their own standing among his followers? The text never offers a straightforward answer, leaving the tension unresolved as if to imply that such internal struggles are a necessary part of the spiritual journey. When the Nag Hammadi scriptures were brought to light in 1945, the Gospel of Philip was one of the invaluable texts rediscovered, but it did not emerge as a flawless volume. The manuscript was damaged, with sections of the writing missing and entire lines having faded into illegibility. This means that what we are able to read today is similar to hearing only select verses of a complete piece of music. Even in this incomplete state, these remaining parts are sufficient to alter our perception of Mary's significance. For some readers, this gospel validates what official religious narrative intentionally excluded. For others, it simply creates more complexities than it resolves. Regardless, it focuses attention on a possibility that the authorized account has long avoided: that Mary was more than a witness or a simple icon of repentance. She may have functioned as a leader, a teacher, and a caretaker of sacred knowledge intended for all disciples. The Vatican has never publicly deemed the Gospel of Philip to be false. Likewise, it has never fully incorporated it into its teachings. It remains in a strange intermediate state between official acknowledgement and quiet omission, a place where history endures without being openly discussed. Perhaps this explains why the text feels so enduringly relevant. Even today, it still echoes the vitality of a period when the ultimate direction of the Church had not yet been solidified, and when a woman's voice could stand alongside a man's without immediate fear of suppression. The deeper one reads into the Gospel of Philip, the more evident it becomes that its central message focuses less on doctrine and more on relationship. It speaks of spiritual harmony, the soul's intrinsic connection to the divine, and understanding that arises from within just as much as from external sources. In its verses, Mary Magdalene is depicted as a person who has already achieved that state of oneness. She does not appear to be striving for it with the same effort as others. Rather, she acts as if she has already passed through some significant unseen transition. One of the most frequently discussed sections describes her simply as someone who consistently accompanied the Lord. The choice of words is simple, but they hold a significance that is difficult to overlook. To walk with him could refer to physical travel, but within this Gospel's context, it more likely signifies something deeper: a persistent spiritual alignment with his teachings, a closeness in spirit that remained unbroken. This is the portrait of a follower who is not marginalized, but who stands at the very core of the early movement. Had such a powerful image been broadly accepted in the earlier centuries, it might have set a standard that leadership and spiritual wisdom could belong equally to both women and men. For a religious body that would later rely on a male-only priesthood for its structure, this would have created a serious institutional obstacle. The choice to exclude certain texts from the official canon may have been partly driven by theological concerns, but it also functioned to restrict the popular image of who was entitled to lead, to teach, and to possess authority. Even in its fragmentary state, the Gospel of Philip suggests a view of faith where access to divine truth is direct and personal, not necessarily filtered solely through a religious organization. This does not imply a rejection of community or tradition, but it strongly suggests that the sacred can communicate with the individual believer without requiring official sanction. That single idea may be the reason why this text, and Mary's prominent place within it, has remained deliberately outside the boundaries of accepted history. When the scroll fragments were first examined after their 1945 retrieval, some experts noted the extraordinary care taken to hide them. It appears that the individuals who concealed them were fully aware they were preserving material considered dangerous, at least in the eyes of those who might have sought to destroy it. The extreme climate of the desert where the texts lay hidden protected them for almost 16 centuries, allowing their content to resurface only when the world was arguably more prepared to contemplate their meaning. Yet even today, the Vatican approaches such writings with a clear sense of caution. There is no open declaration of heresy, but neither is there any celebration of their rediscovery. They are acknowledged as a legitimate part of the historical record of early Christian philosophy. However, their potential to influence contemporary faith is carefully managed and contained. In that narrow margin between silence and recognition, the voice of Mary Magdalene persists, carrying with it the possibility of a spiritual practice less defined by rigid structure and more welcoming to the light of truth that is available to all sincere seekers. Within the surviving sections of the Gospel of Philip, there is a narrative cadence that is different from other ancient Christian documents. It does not progress in a linear fashion, detailing one event after another. Instead, it seems to circle back to core ideas, returning to them much like a tide washes repeatedly upon the same coastline. This non-linear form of writing guides the reader into a calmer, more contemplative state, suggesting that the text was meant for quiet study in small groups rather than for formal debate in a large assembly. In that introspective space, Mary Magdalene's presence feels constant, like a steady light that does not flicker even when challenged by outside forces. The vocabulary used to describe her is one of familiarity, but also of deep respect. She is not reduced to a single function or defined solely by one past event in her life. Instead, she recurs in different roles, as a dedicated listener, a trusted companion, an inquisitive student, and a recipient of hidden wisdom. The text presents these multiple roles as inherent to her character, not as exceptions to a rule. This singular approach alone sets the Gospel apart from the later religious writings that worked to limit her image to that of a penitent. If we consider the early communities that likely read the Gospel of Philip, we might visualize small gatherings in unadorned spaces where the credibility of the person speaking came from the depth of their understanding rather than from an official designation. In such a setting, a woman like Mary would have been free to speak and teach just as freely as any man. She could share what she had learned without being told to stand aside for the emerging institutional authority that would later grow into a powerful organization. This kind of openness must have seemed precarious, too vulnerable to break if not strictly managed. The formal rejection of the Gospel of Philip may have been framed in terms of ensuring theological clarity, but the outcome was also deeply social. By excluding the text from general circulation, the complex and powerful version of Mary it contained was also effectively silenced. This allowed an alternate image to take root, one that maintained her importance, but only in ways that supported the existing ecclesiastical hierarchy. The decision to keep the Gospel outside the canon did not succeed in completely destroying it, though the concealed copies were only preserved in areas where the central church's influence was less pervasive. Over time, these copies were either buried or carefully sealed away, their words held in long silence. When they were recovered in 1945, they brought with them the faint echo of a time when the boundaries of leadership within the faith were far more fluid. Even today, reading the Gospel of Philip can feel like standing in a sacred room that the Vatican has never fully opened to the wider public. The door is slightly ajar, just enough to permit a narrow beam of light to enter, but not wide enough to reveal the complete truth. Through that restricted view, we catch sight of Mary Magdalene, not in the way history has typically portrayed her, but as she might have been before the centuries reshaped her into a character that was safer and easier for the Church to integrate. And it is this unguarded image of her that still causes an intrinsic discomfort in the quiet inner halls of the Church. There is a calm confidence in the way the Gospel of Philip speaks about Mary Magdalene. It does not seek permission to show her standing close to Jesus during moments of profound intimacy and trust. It simply portrays her there as if it were the most natural and expected thing to happen. That fact alone may explain why this particular text has remained mostly in the shadows rather than in the public light. In a faith that would later structure itself around placing men at every level of visible leadership, a narrative where a woman is shown as the most trusted recipient of wisdom could have radically reshaped the entire pattern with just one short passage. Mary's close relationship with Jesus is so evident among the other disciples that it becomes a source of clear tension. They openly question why he seems to love her more than them. And while the missing portions of the manuscript leave the complete reply unknown, the overall tone implies that this profound connection is rooted in a shared spiritual understanding, not mere personal preference. She is depicted as a person who already comprehends what the others are still struggling to grasp. This is a position not earned through a formal vote or official designation. It is a place earned through sincere listening, devoted learning, and consistently living out the principles she was taught. The very idea that spiritual authority could be derived from such personal qualities rather than from an established, rigid hierarchy was, and continues to be, profoundly challenging. It suggests that the sacred cannot be fully confined within buildings, rites, or titles. It is free to move wherever it wills, and sometimes it moves toward those whom human tradition least expects. When the fragments of the Gospel of Philip were first examined after their 1945 discovery, the global community was still not ready to have a wide-ranging conversation about the full implications for the Church. Scholars focused on debating language, historical context, and symbolic meaning, but the larger questions of leadership and gender were frequently avoided. In some ways, that academic silence served as its own method of control. Without an open mainstream discussion, the true significance of the text remained concealed, much like the original manuscripts had been for hundreds of years. Within the Vatican, these writings are handled with careful, almost delicate restraint. They are not formally condemned as heretical in the way some medieval documents were, but neither are they fully embraced for study by the faithful. They occupy a strange, undefined middle ground, acknowledged as a factual part of history, but not regarded as a genuine part of the living, guiding tradition. For those who view Mary Magdalene as the ultimate messenger to the other apostles, this quiet sidelining feels like a profound loss. And yet, the very persistence of these fragments guarantees that her voice has not been entirely muted. She continues to speak across the centuries, even if only in pieces. In the calm and measured style of the Gospel of Philip, she stands as a powerful reminder that some truths, once they have been spoken into the world, can never be completely suppressed again. That may be why her story, in this unique form, remains both a source of deep personal inspiration and a quiet cause for institutional discomfort within the Church's deepest inner sanctums. Some academics suggest that the deep-seated discomfort surrounding the Gospel of Philip is less about its specific content and more about the radical possibilities it introduces. Once you accept the idea that Mary Magdalene functioned as a true equal and active partner in the central mission of Jesus, other challenging questions immediately arise. Who else might have held such an influential role? How many vital perspectives were intentionally excluded when the New Testament was assembled? And if early Christian leadership could have taken a completely different form, what would that imply for the modern structure? The text itself never openly criticizes the other disciples or the hierarchical structures that would later evolve. Instead, it offers an entirely different vision, one in which proximity to the divine is granted not by rank or position, but by genuine spiritual understanding. That understanding is portrayed as something deeply personal, almost an intimate exchange between the teacher and the individual student. In the world described by the Gospel of Philip, such moments of profound insight are not rare privileges reserved for a few. They are presented as the absolute heart of the faith experience. For the Vatican, which is tasked with protecting a tradition that has been solidified over many centuries, this presents a subtle yet powerful contradiction. It fundamentally shifts the center of spiritual authority from the central institution to the individual, from the established hierarchy to the inner life of the heart. This does not completely negate the essential value of the Church, but it powerfully suggests that its power structure is not the only legitimate path to God. This revolutionary idea has always been difficult to fully contain because it naturally encourages believers to seek truth outside the defined boundaries of what is officially authorized. When the Gospel of Philip was first made available in contemporary languages after 1945, it immediately drew attention from historians, theologians, and general readers alike. Some saw it as confirmation of long-held doubts about the composition of the early church. Others quickly dismissed it as the product of a small, marginal group with no lasting historical influence. The true answer likely lies somewhere in the middle of these extremes. Even if the community that originally produced the text was small, its vision of spiritual life carried enough beauty and intellectual depth to endure centuries of intentional silence. In a profound way, the mere survival of the text mirrors the long story of Mary herself. Consistently pushed to the periphery, frequently misrepresented and often misunderstood, she still remains a palpable presence in the collective memory of the Church. The Gospel of Philip actively restores her to a place of fundamental respect and significant influence, even if this only occurs for those willing to read and interpret the historical record with fresh eyes. And so, in the low-light reading rooms where ancient manuscripts rest in quiet, protected drawers, one can easily picture the Gospel of Philip lying among them, its fragile edges softened by time, but its unique perspective entirely preserved. It speaks not with tones of anger or open defiance, but with a quiet, persistent certainty. It gently suggests that truth is not a fragile thing, and that it has the capacity to wait as long as it must until the right moment arrives for it to be heard. Perhaps this is why, after all this time, Mary Magdalene's presence in this text still feels so alive, like an enduring flame that is never fully extinguished, no matter how long it has been shielded from the prevailing currents within the Vatican's most private rooms. The Gospel of Philip is not a forbidden book in the dramatic, historical sense of that word, but it is certainly not placed directly into the hands of the general faithful either. It occupies that peculiar and strange transitional space where the Church neither fully embraces its content nor actively works to fully condemn it. This very careful and deliberate balance may appear odd, but it serves a strategic function. By acknowledging its existence yet purposefully maintaining a respectful distance, the Vatican avoids drawing undue attention to its radical ideas while also preventing it from directly shaping mainstream religious practice. For those few who have dedicated their lives to studying the text in detail, the underlying institutional discomfort is simple to comprehend. Mary Magdalene, as she is depicted here, is by no means a silent or passive figure kneeling at the edges of the narrative. She is a dedicated student trusted with the deepest esoteric meanings, a confident voice unafraid to speak her mind, and someone whose close personal relationship with Jesus is presented as an established fact, not a mere rumour or subject of speculation. If this compelling image of her were to become widespread, it could not help but inspire serious questions about why the institutional church has failed to preserve such a view in its official, established doctrines. The surviving fragments of the text reveal an entirely different way of approaching faith, one that is highly personal and profoundly introspective. It does not eliminate the fundamental need for community, but it firmly places the possibility of experiencing the divine directly within the immediate reach of every single believer. That distinct message is inherently empowering, yet it can be deeply unsettling for an established tradition that relies heavily on clear, unbroken lines of spiritual guidance and hierarchical authority. In this light, the Gospel of Philip becomes more than just an old manuscript. It functions as a powerful mirror reflecting an early version of Christianity that was notably less concerned with rigid control and far more focused on personal spiritual connection. The 1945 discovery of the text was almost entirely an accident of fate. Found, secured within a simple clay vessel that had been buried in the Egyptian sands for centuries, it had been successfully hidden away from both active destruction and public scrutiny, perhaps by those who knew it would be safest when completely silent. When it finally emerged, the world had evolved sufficiently that it could be studied without the immediate threat of suppression. And yet the continued institutional caution with which it has been treated since its discovery suggests that some profound fears still remain. Reading its words in the present day, one can almost physically sense the vast distance between the early world it describes and the structured one we now inhabit. In that original world, Mary is not diminished by her gender, nor is she solely confined to the simplistic role of the penitent. She stands confidently alongside the men, freely receiving and dispensing knowledge. That clear, though understated image has the genuine power to fundamentally reshape how people think about discipleship and the nature of spiritual leadership. Perhaps this is why, even today, the Vatican handles the Gospel of Philip with such delicate and controlled care. Not because its content is provably false, but because it contains a powerful truth that simply does not fit neatly within the ecclesiastical walls that have been built and reinforced over the centuries. A truth that once genuinely seen and understood cannot easily be forgotten. And so the ancient manuscript patiently waits, just as Mary's authentic voice has always waited, for those who are willing to step into the quiet historical shadows and truly listen to what it says. Some observers argue that the most significant aspect of the Gospel of Philip is not its explicit content, but the silent, persistent way it managed to survive. The jar that held it securely in the Egyptian desert remained perfectly sealed for well over a millennium before a local farmer's shovel accidentally struck it in 1945. The ancient air that finally touched its fragile pages for the first time in centuries carried with it the palpable weight of that long period of imposed silence. Whoever originally hid the text had likely done so in great haste, probably knowing that its discovery during their own lifetime would inevitably lead to its destruction. When the fragments were finally translated and studied, it became obvious that they belonged to a spiritual tradition distinctly different from that of the four Gospels included in the official Bible. The entire document's tone was contemplative, layered deeply with symbolic language, and primarily concerned with the process of inner, personal transformation. Mary Magdalene appears within its pages as someone who had already travelled a great distance along the spiritual path it described. She was not depicted as someone seeking approval to understand. She already possessed that deep understanding. This was not the passive Mary of countless sermons, shrouded in remorse and kneeling in silent repentance, but a dynamic Mary whose spiritual wisdom actively shaped the faith of others around her. It is easy to see why this could generate profound discomfort for the Vatican. In the long-established official tradition, spiritual leadership and teaching authority have consistently been defined as flowing directly downward from the central hierarchy. The Gospel of Philip, however, presents a completely different current, one that originates deep within the individual soul and moves outward, unconstrained by any religious office or formal title. If that alternate current is fully acknowledged, the core role of the institution shifts radically from being the sole ultimate gatekeeper of divine truth to merely being one of many supportive voices guiding the faithful. In a dimly lit reading room of the Vatican Library, such a precious manuscript might rest inside a simple archival box, deliberately kept far from any public exhibition. Its physical survival is permitted, its words carefully conserved in precise scholarly editions or on the fading original parchment, but it remains permanently in a state of quiet, strategic containment. This approach permits the Church to honour its undeniable historical importance while simultaneously keeping its powerful, radical influence strictly limited. Yet even in this imposed quietude, the text continues its work of speaking. Every scholar who cautiously turns its brittle pages brings its core ideas back into the present moment. Every new translation slowly places its words into new minds and ears, and with every reading, Mary's full role grows a little clearer and more fully realised. She is a true companion in the deepest sense of the word, someone who walks alongside, who truly sees, and who actively remembers. Perhaps this is why the Vatican's long-standing apprehension concerning Mary Magdalene is not actually about scandal or historical rumour, but about the profound possibility her story represents. The possibility that her complete story, told fully and honestly, would open doors that have long been intentionally kept shut. The possibility that believers might recognize themselves in her not as passive observers, but as active, authoritative bearers of the sacred. And once that door is fully opened, even the strongest institutional walls cannot prevent the light of that truth from spilling through and illuminating everything. In a quiet moment of imagination, it is not difficult to picture a solitary archivist in the Vatican slowly turning the fragile pages of the Gospel of Philip. Late at night, the immense building surrounding him would be completely silent, except for the soft sound of his chair moving against the marble floor. The distinct scent of dust and ancient leather would permeate the air, and the pale, concentrated light from a single reading lamp would rest on the words that have journeyed across centuries to reach him. He would fully recognize the tremendous value of what he held, not merely as a priceless artifact, but as a living voice from an entirely different alternative vision of the faith. The Mary Magdalene found in these pages is not a complex historical puzzle to him. She's presented as clear, immediate, and perfectly at ease in the company of Jesus. She's not separated from him by any official title, by prevailing social custom, or by the inherent gender barriers of her era. She speaks, she questions, and she receives direct answers. Theirs is a profound relationship constructed upon mutual spiritual trust, not upon religious ceremony. And in the very measured, deliberate rhythm of the Gospel of Philip, this spiritual trust feels as utterly solid and immovable as stone. The archivist might pause to consider what the outcome would be if these exact words were read aloud to a massive gathering of the faithful inside St. Peter's Basilica. How would the modern audience truly hear them? Would they find them deeply troubling to their existing faith? Or would they discover in the text a vital warmth and directness that has been noticeably absent from the way Mary's narrative is typically shared? It is impossible to know for sure, but the very act of merely contemplating such an outcome could feel inherently dangerous to someone whose primary responsibility is preserving both the precious treasures of the Church and its institutional stability. It is this critical balance between preservation and strategic protection that maintains the Gospel of Philip in its current half-hidden state. The Vatican does not deny its physical existence. It even permits specialized scholars to study it under carefully managed conditions. But it strictly avoids placing it into the hands of those who might feel empowered to use its contents to actively challenge the way authority and spiritual leadership have been understood and enforced for nearly 2,000 years. In truth, the Vatican's institutional caution is not exclusively about Mary Magdalene. It is fundamentally about the alternative pattern of discipleship her story represents. If a woman could truly be a respected leader, a trusted keeper of esoteric knowledge, and a spiritual equal in the first century, then the entire historical narrative of the Church would need to be fundamentally retold. Every single component of its complex structure, from its top-down leadership model to its formal liturgy, would need to fully account for the voices it has for so long deliberately relegated to the background. So, the Gospel of Philip waits patiently, its words calm and assured, as if they inherently understand that time is ultimately on their side. The archivist slowly closes the protective box. The lock clicks softly into place, and the room once more returns to darkness. But the profound thought remains that somewhere within those ancient pages lies a compelling vision of the Church, one that is both profoundly ancient and startlingly new, and that Mary's genuine voice, though now quiet, will always eventually find a way to be fully heard. Even once the box is securely locked and returned to its designated shelf, the powerful presence of the Gospel of Philip still lingers like a subtle, persistent fragrance in the otherwise still room. The archivist may walk away, yet the profound words he has just read remain with him, echoing in the measured sound of his footsteps along the cold stone corridor. It is not just the precise content of the ancient text that leaves an indelible impression, but the overwhelming sense that it belongs to a powerful stream of historical memory the Church has attempted to control without ever being able to fully contain. Mary Magdalene stands directly at the heart of that living stream. In the pages of this singular gospel, she is not a distant, passive witness watching significant events unfold from the safe margins. She is an active, vital participant in the deepest spiritual conversations, entrusted with meanings that defy being reduced to simplistic rules. Her inherent place beside Jesus feels completely natural here, not exceptional or scandalous, as though the earliest form of the faith moved with a rhythm where her voice and presence were simply an indispensable part of the overall harmony. That very rhythm is what later institutional history may have deeply feared. It represents a way of being in faith where no single institutional authority is able to control the natural flow of spiritual understanding, where divine truth can emerge in the quiet, intimate exchange between teacher and dedicated student, and where women are completely capable of carrying the exact same weight of spiritual knowledge as men. The Vatican, in its fundamental institutional role as the primary guardian of its established tradition, may well perceive such historical openness as a profound risk to the rigid structure it has meticulously built and defended over many centuries. When the Gospel of Philip reappeared in 1945, the world was in a vastly different place than when it was originally hidden. Modern printing technology, academic discourse, and widespread translation meant that its challenging contents could not be locked away and forgotten as easily as before. Still, its overall reach into the everyday life and devotion of the faithful has been carefully limited, partly by deliberately treating it as nothing more than an interesting historical document rather than a powerful, living text capable of spiritual guidance. And yet, the life in it is undeniable. Those who read it slowly, without rushing to either instantly explain or rigidly define its meaning, often discover that its complex symbols gently open more profound doors of insight than they seek to close. The message of oneness, illumination, and spiritual evolution contained within this text feels utterly timeless, an essence that refuses to disappear even after resting beneath the sand for centuries. Seen through this perspective, Mary's character offers a kind of mirror to the person reading, a quiet reminder that insight isn't always granted by formal structures, but is frequently discovered by having the courage to truly pay attention. In the final analysis, the Gospel of Philip endures much like the memory of Mary, partly revealed and partly obscured, patiently waiting for those willing to commit to the search. The scholar whose job it is to archive this manuscript may lock the door on it for the evening, but the narrative it carries cannot be contained in that chamber. It persists in whispers, in unanswered questions, and in the silent hope that one day the institution of the Church might choose to share her entire account, allowing her to be recognized as she once was beside Jesus, completely unafraid and prepared to speak her truth. Should the moment ever come for the Gospel of Philip to be publicly read under the great dome of St. Peter's Basilica, it will have a sound unlike any other holy writing heard in that place. The voice won't rise with the formal ceremonial rhythm of a religious service, but will instead flow in a slower, more deeply personal pace. It would feel less like an official statement and more like an honest conversation, the kind of intimate insight shared quietly between close friends at the close of a day. And in that instant, Mary Magdalene would enter the space in a manner she hasn't for hundreds of years, not as a static figure in a stained glass window, but as a dynamic, living presence within the sacred history of faith. Her close relationship with Jesus, precisely as portrayed in this gospel, would not be perceived as a threat to the listeners, unless they had been explicitly instructed to fear or control that closeness. In this context, trust is earned not through holding a religious position or adhering to tradition, but through profound understanding. And if the faithful were to truly hear this, they might begin to consider what other voices, long since silenced, also deserve to be rediscovered and heard. The Vatican has consistently protected against such moments, not with outright force or destruction, but with deliberate silence and careful management. The gospel is maintained, it is studied, and it is meticulously catalogued, yet it remains fundamentally absent from the spaces where communities of believers gather for worship. This is not an act of malice toward Mary or a denial of her significance, but an institutional attempt to preserve the established structure of the Church's historical narrative. Still, the very necessity of this caution strongly suggests that her role possesses an enduring power that time has not been able to diminish. When biblical experts translate the Gospel of Philip, they frequently note the remarkable tone of its language. It feels like a complex woven tapestry of remembrance, deeper meaning, and spiritual instruction, created specifically for individuals who want to engage deeply with the sacred rather than simply observing it from a distance. The complex symbolism of light, perfect union, and the bridal chamber speaks not of a worldly marriage, but of a soul's complete and total acceptance of divine reality. Mary, within this unique vision, seems to have already achieved that total embrace, making her not merely a student receiving instruction, but a powerful lived example of the teaching itself. If this image were to become a central point of the Church's self-understanding, it could unlock possibilities that have been kept sealed for nearly 2 millennia. It would directly challenge the long-standing belief that authority in spiritual matters must always cascade from the top down, suggesting instead that it can emerge naturally wherever the Spirit actively moves. And perhaps this truth is exactly why, even following the Gospel's rediscovery in 1945, its message continues to exist in a kind of half-light, known yet never fully shared. However, history demonstrates that time inevitably loosens even the strongest of restrictions. One day, the quiet wisdom contained in the Gospel of Philip may be presented to the entire world without reservation. And when that day arrives, Mary Magdalene will cease to be a mere shadow at the margin of history. She will become the clear, unmistakable voice of a trusted companion speaking across the ages to everyone who is prepared to listen. Should the day ever come when the Gospel of Philip is finally read aloud under the monumental dome of St. Peter's Basilica, its sound will be distinct from any scripture that has echoed there before. The reading would not adopt the stiff, formal pacing of religious ritual, but would instead flow with a more deliberate, deeply intimate rhythm. It would feel far less like an official pronouncement and more like a sincere, private sharing, the kind of spiritual truth exchanged between allies in the profound calm of evening. In that moment, Mary Magdalene would step fully into the room in a manner she has not for centuries, not as a passive likeness made of coloured glass, but as a vital, living presence within the collective narrative of faith. The close bond she shared with Jesus, as authentically shown in this gospel, would not provoke anxiety among those hearing it, unless they had been deliberately trained to believe that such a relationship must be regulated and controlled. Here, spiritual trust is fundamentally granted not through rank or institution, but through authentic, personal insight. And were the faithful to genuinely absorb this message, they might begin to question what other long-ignored voices might equally deserve to be brought back into the conversation. The Vatican has chosen to guard against such an expansive moment, not through outright censorship or persecution, but with a careful, protective silence. The manuscript is preserved, it is analysed, and it is officially catalogued, yet it remains intentionally excluded from the places where believers meet for communal devotion. This action is not driven by hostility toward Mary or a denial of her essential importance, but represents a means of maintaining the established, stable framework of the Church's historical narrative. Yet the very necessity for such deep-seated caution implies that her specific role contains a profound, undying power that has resisted the passage of time. When scholars embark on translating the Gospel of Philip, they routinely draw attention to the texture and tone of its original language. It creates an impression of being a complex fabric woven from memory, symbolism, and spiritual guidance, tailored for those who seek to engage in an intimate journey with the sacred rather than merely observing it passively. The rich symbolism of light, ultimate unity, and the sacred bridal chamber signifies not a physical human marriage, but the soul's complete transformative embrace of divine truth. Mary, as presented in this profound vision, appears to already inhabit that embrace, establishing her as not merely a recipient of sacred knowledge, but as a living, vibrant embodiment of it. If this potent image were to become integral to the core understanding of the Church, it could open spiritual avenues that have been deliberately closed off for nearly 2,000 years. It would fundamentally challenge the ancient assumption that spiritual leadership must always originate from the highest office, suggesting instead that it can manifest organically wherever the Spirit chooses to move. And this is likely the profound reason why, even after the original manuscript was unearthed in 1945, its voice persists only in a partial light. It is known, but it is not openly and universally celebrated. Still, the movement of time possesses an uncanny ability to undo even the firmest locks. One day, the unassuming words of the Gospel of Philip may finally be spoken to the world without hesitation or fear. And when that moment arrives, Mary Magdalene will no longer be a ghost-like shadow at the farthest edge of history, but the clear, resonant voice of a true companion, reaching across the centuries to touch the hearts of all who are finally ready to hear. Should that future day arrive, when the Gospel of Philip transitions from being a carefully guarded artifact to an active, living voice within the Church, it will probably happen without any dramatic spectacle. Transformation within a long-established faith often arrives, not with a sudden, disruptive impact, but rather like the slow, quiet unfolding of dawn, a gradual increase of light that simply reveals what has been fundamentally present all along. Mary Magdalene standing beside Jesus, as clearly documented in this Gospel, is not a radical new idea. It is, in fact, incredibly ancient. It only feels new because the weight of centuries has constructed so many barriers between her and the community of the faithful. In the text itself, her critical role is neither apologized for nor defensively justified. It is simply an organic piece of the larger story, woven naturally into the fabric of the teachings and the symbols, as though the idea of anyone attempting to remove it would be completely unthinkable. This air of effortless inclusion is precisely what makes the Gospel so strikingly important. It fully reflects a time when the powerful memory of Mary, as a decisive leader, had not yet been pruned and reduced to fit a much smaller, more controlled narrative frame. For those who encounter her in this original light today, there is a deep feeling of personal recognition, as if something critically essential that was lost has finally been returned. The institutional caution maintained by the Vatican may well be rooted in its self-appointed duty as the guardian of unity. A profound shift in how Mary is understood could undeniably invite other complex questions regarding the very earliest years of the Christian faith, questions for which there are no easy, simple answers. Yet, to intentionally hold back the full version of the story is also to deliberately keep a part of the truth obscured in shadow, and history consistently shows that truth, in the long run, very rarely remains fully hidden. Since the profound finding in 1945, the Gospel of Philip has been processed by countless individuals, archaeologists, dedicated translators, rigorous historians, and thoughtful theologians. Each group has applied its own professional lens, and each has subtly contributed something unique to the modern understanding of the text. However, the core essence of the manuscript remains utterly inviolable, the powerful image of Mary Magdalene as a profoundly trusted companion, a woman whose voice was absolutely vital during the most sacred, defining moments. For many contemporary readers, engaging with these words is not about an aggressive attempt to rewrite foundational scripture, but about an organic expansion of their spiritual vision. It is about perceiving the roots of the Church as being broad and deep enough to contain more than just the single familiar version of the story, In this sense, the Gospel of Philip serves less as an argument and more as a profound invitation, an opening toward a vision of faith where true intimacy with the divine is measured not by one's established rank, but by the honest readiness of the heart. Perhaps one day this expansive, inclusive vision will naturally integrate itself into the official public life of the Church. Until that day comes, it continues to move quietly through the minds and hearts of those who have taken the time to read it, carrying the unmistakable image of Mary as she was known, present, equal, and utterly without fear. And perhaps this truth is the deepest reason why her story still evokes both immense reverence and institutional wariness, because it stands as a clear reminder that some essential truths will never simply fade with time, they simply wait. And when they are finally heard again, they carry the power of feeling as though they had never truly gone away. In the profound silence of night, it is effortless to imagine the Gospel of Philip not as a sealed artifact locked in a vault, but as a living voice gently traversing the centuries. It does not rush or forcefully demand attention. It waits, with a deep patience that rivals the turning of the seasons, carrying with it the complete, unedited image of Mary Magdalene. In this account, she is not merely a small fragment of a much larger story. She's the essential living thread that connects the moments before and after the resurrection, possessing the quiet, unshakable strength of someone who truly saw and deeply understood. Such an image possesses extraordinary gravity. It speaks directly to a historical era when authority in the nascent Christian Church was shaped just as much by genuine spiritual experience and direct personal presence as it was by any formal clerical designation. This specific type of authority is inherently more difficult for an institution to control because it arises from an internal source rather than from an external decree. It takes root and flourishes within the heart of the individual believer, and it is instinctively recognized by others, just as the disciples described in the Gospel of Philip recognized Mary's unique closeness to Jesus, even if they sometimes struggled to fully grasp its meaning. For the Vatican to grant full institutional acceptance to this vision would necessarily mean permitting the faithful to understand spiritual leadership as something that can equally rest upon the shoulders of both women and men. It would mean opening the archives not just to professional scholars, but to any person who possesses the simple willingness to listen. And once those doors are fully opened, the Church would have to be prepared to live with every new question and possibility that steps through. Since its accidental rediscovery in 1945, the Gospel of Philip has resembled a small, cherished flame carefully shielded in a protected alcove. Those who stumble upon it tend to guard it with great care, sharing it with others only in small private circles. In these intimate settings, Mary is peacefully restored to her rightful place alongside Jesus, without the need for a single argument, as if she had been visibly there all along. The true fear, perhaps, is not that the text would provoke chaos or schism, but that it would inspire profound, gentle change, a change born not from anger or organized protest, but from genuine, deep recognition. It is intrinsically difficult to resist something that feels profoundly and fundamentally right, something that heals and restores rather than simply divides. And so, the Gospel of Philip continues to reside in its half-lit state, meticulously preserved but never officially proclaimed. Yet the spiritual light it carries still manages to slip through the smallest cracks, effortlessly reaching those who are ready to perceive it. In the end, it may be Mary Magdalene herself who offers the final, defining lesson, that truth does not have to be shouted from the rooftops to endure. It can be carried quietly, securely, within the individual heart until the precise moment arrives when the wider world is truly ready to hear its message in full. One can vividly picture that future day when the Gospel of Philip will no longer be discussed in reverent, hushed tones, but will instead be read openly, exposed to the elements. The words would ascend like a spiritual incense, and those listening might feel a powerful sense of hearing a long-suppressed memory suddenly returning to vibrant life. Mary Magdalene would finally emerge from the historical shadows, not as a figure reimagined for contemporary sensibilities, but as she was genuinely remembered by those who knew her most intimately, a faithful companion, a trusted confidant, a clear bearer of the most profound and secret teachings. This institutional shift would not serve to erase the complex traditions that have shaped the Church for centuries, but would profoundly widen their scope. It would add a vital missing thread to the massive spiritual tapestry, a thread that was always fundamentally present, but woven in so subtly that it became impossible to see. For some, this complete revelation would be deeply unsettling, not because it is false, but because it challenges their conviction that the story they inherited was already finished and complete. The Vatican has long managed such potential challenges with a cautious, slow-moving patience. In their view, profound truth must be unveiled in a way that prioritizes and preserves institutional unity. But a unity that is contingent upon keeping certain historical voices permanently silent is, by its very nature, fundamentally fragile. The Gospel of Philip offers an entirely different model of unity, one founded on the open recognition that God's comprehensive wisdom has never been restricted to a singular form or a single officially sanctioned messenger. Since its dramatic unearthing in 1945, the Gospel has been intensely studied, passionately debated, and interpreted through countless academic and theological perspectives. Yet despite the vast differences in scholarly opinion, there is a single undeniable point upon which almost all readers agree. Mary's specific role within its pages is unmistakably central and crucial. Her presence is not a secondary detail or a mere decorative embellishment. It is woven directly into the heart of the text, appearing as natural and completely unforced as sunlight pouring through an open door. If that door were ever fully opened and the faithful were genuinely invited to step through, they might discover a church that feels simultaneously ancient and radically renewed. A church where the voices that were once systematically set aside are actively welcomed back into the central circle. A church where genuine leadership is recognized in the unmistakable fruits of deep compassion and spiritual understanding, rather than only in the superficial markings of an official office. Until that day, the Gospel of Philip will continue its quiet, purposeful journey, moving from one careful, trusted reader to the next. Its potent words will continue to ensure Mary's active presence remains alive, not as a challenge to the integrity of the faith, but as a powerful reminder of its most early and most inclusive days. And perhaps this is the true secret of its enduring power, because some essential truths once spoken do not require being constantly shouted. They choose to live on, nurtured in the hearts of those who have heard, patiently awaiting the pivotal moment when the entire world is finally ready to listen. When that pivotal moment eventually arrives, it will feel less like a startling, sudden discovery and far more like a cherished memory finally resurfacing. The Gospel of Philip does not portray Mary Magdalene in a way that provokes immediate shock or resistance. Instead, it offers her presence as something intrinsically gentle and absolutely certain, as though she had always been visibly standing beside Jesus in the telling of the story, and only the modern listener had inexplicably forgotten her. Her image here is complete, neither diminished nor artificially embellished beyond recognition, but simply steady, deeply human, and profoundly trusted. The consequential effect of such a historical restoration would ripple gently yet fundamentally throughout the Church. Sermons would begin to draw not solely from the four conventionally familiar Gospels, but also from words that were once buried deep beneath the desert sands. The faithful would slowly begin to hear Mary's voice, not as a faint, distant echo from the periphery, but as a clear, necessary note within the greater harmony of early Christian witness. With that singular change, the Church's narrative would gain immense depth, not lose it. for it would more accurately reflect the true breadth and diversity of the community that first carried the transformative message of Jesus. It is possible that this deeper potential change, more than any other single factor, fully explains the Vatican's enduring hesitation. History is never easily rewritten. An established tradition, once solidified, naturally resists new challenging threads being woven into its structure. Yet, the Gospel of Philip clearly demonstrates that those threads were always inherently there, merely obscured from the common view. To pull them forward would necessitate acknowledging that the story passionately recounted for centuries has been incomplete, not fundamentally wrong, but simply unfinished. The manuscript's painstaking journey since 1945 has been one of careful, measured steps. It has moved from the loose sands of Egypt to the formal tables of scholars, from extremely fragile parchment to widely distributed printed pages in countless languages. And yet, even today, its most revolutionary image, the unshakable companionship between Jesus and Mary, remains explicitly known to only a small fraction of the entire faithful community. In hushed reading rooms, dedicated researchers still intently lean over the faded ancient lines, meticulously piecing together the intended meaning from the surviving fragments. In living rooms and small focused study groups, believers still quietly share specific passages in low voices, as if the very words themselves carry a kind of private, profound holiness. The Gospel actively lives on in these intimate spaces, situated outside the grand walls of official liturgy, yet undeniably alive nonetheless. Perhaps this profound endurance is Mary Magdalene's truest and most lasting legacy. Not simply that she walked physically beside Jesus, but that she continues to walk faithfully beside the absolute truth, even when its movement is slow and even when it remains partially hidden. The Gospel of Philip is her silent, powerful testimony, delivered in the pure language of trust, and trust is an essence that cannot be obliterated by the passing of time. One day, when the Church has fully matured and is finally ready, her complete story will step boldly into the full light. Until that moment, she waits patiently in the half-shadow, her voice steady and her presence utterly undimmed, carrying a truth that has never once truly departed. In that lingering half-shadow, Mary's complete story breathes with a patience that feels nearly eternal. The Gospel of Philip makes no desperate rush to prove her profound worth or to aggressively argue her specific case. It simply portrays her as she authentically was, deeply welcomed, completely trusted, and absolutely present in the defining moments that mattered most. This quiet, unshakable certainty is perhaps the most challenging aspect of the entire text, because it intentionally leaves no possible space to easily dismiss her as an outsider. She fundamentally belongs at the very heart of the entire narrative, and once a reader has truly recognized that fact, it becomes incredibly difficult to unsee. For centuries, the Vatican has deliberately held to the belief that protecting the spiritual integrity of the faithful sometimes requires actively protecting them from certain potentially disruptive truths. Until the prescribed time is deemed correct, the Gospel of Philip rests securely in that strictly guarded space. Its existence is fully acknowledged, but it is very rarely given any public voice in communal devotion. Those devout individuals who actively seek it out must intentionally step off the well-worn usual path into specialized libraries, historical archives, and the pages of highly specific academic studies. There, they discover not a scandal or a threat, but a vision of the faith expansive enough to comfortably hold both the familiar traditional Gospels and this quieter, yet profoundly intimate, witness. Since the manuscript dramatically emerged from the Egyptian desert in 1945, its very presence has been like a soft, persistent knocking at the heavy door of history. Some have eagerly answered that call immediately, anxious to explore the implications of what it might mean. Others have chosen to keep the door firmly closed, remaining wary of the profound institutional changes that might follow. And so the gentle knocking continues, steady and deeply patient. A constant reminder that the truth does not wait for any single person, but it does wait with remarkable grace. Mary's unique portrayal in the Gospel of Philip is not intended as an aggressive attack on the established church, nor is it an attempt to completely rewrite the fundamental foundations of the faith. It is instead a massive expansion, a widening of the historical view so that the early church can finally be seen for what it actually was. A diverse gathering powerfully shaped by a multitude of voices, some of which have been unjustly set aside for far too long. In this compelling account, she is never presented as a simple rival to Peter or the other apostles. She stands as their truest companion in the most essential sense, a fellow trusted bearer of the revolutionary message, deeply trusted to both fully understand and to teach it. If her full story were to be recounted in this manner within the grand official halls of St. Peter's, it might not trigger the complete collapse that some fear. Instead, it could bring forth a profound, quiet strength, a renewed, powerful sense that the deep roots of the Church extend much further back and deeper than anyone has yet dared to fully trace. But for the present, those vital roots remain partially concealed, their full shape only glimpsed by those who actively lean in and commit to a closer look. The Gospel of Philip remains an essential bridge between the historical past that we think we know and the historical past that is still patiently waiting to be fully remembered. And upon that delicate bridge stands Mary Magdalene, her penetrating gaze steady, her voice calm and completely unhurried, patiently ready for the pivotal day when her complete story can finally walk freely and openly in the light. If that day finally arrives, it will likely come with great subtlety, almost completely unnoticed at first. Perhaps a devoted scholar will finally publish a definitive work that successfully reaches far beyond the narrow walls of the academic community. Or possibly, a thoughtful priest will simply choose to openly share a single passage from the Gospel of Philip during an intimate small parish gathering. In that very moment, the powerful image of Mary Magdalene as a fully trusted companion and an equal witness will gently, organically slip into the waiting hearts of the listeners. They may not instantly recognize the profound significance then, but something crucial will have permanently shifted. The story they believed they knew will no longer feel complete without her standing securely in her rightful historical place. The Vatican, despite all its historical caution, has been the very institution that has preserved the critical text that carries her voice. This fact alone is truly remarkable. The manuscript could have been aggressively destroyed, completely dismissed as fraud, or deliberately hidden beyond any possible access. Instead, it rests securely within the archives, fully accessible under specific, controlled conditions, as though the Church fundamentally recognizes its importance, but is still internally struggling to determine how much of that truth the wider world is truly prepared to hold. That profound act of preservation inherently suggests an implicit recognition that history itself is far vaster and more complex than the small pieces that have already been officially told. Mary's enduring presence in the Gospel of Philip acts like a crucial doorway into that much larger untold history. It immediately invites challenging questions that cannot be easily dismissed once they have been asked. What if leadership roles in the very earliest Christian communities were actually more balanced and less rigidly defined than we have been led to believe? What if the collective memory of that balance still actively stirs within the living, breathing life of the Church, patiently waiting for its rightful moment to return? These are not simple accusations. They are profound, transformative possibilities. And such possibilities, once truly seen, possess an astonishing power. Since 1945, the Gospel's difficult journey has powerfully mirrored Mary's own historical struggle, pushed to the very edges, yet never fully erased. In its sacred words, she's presented not as a mere symbol of repentance, but as a genuine figure of deep spiritual understanding, a woman whose profound insight is both intensely personal and universally applicable. Her fundamental role is not simply to witness, but to actively carry forward a spiritual truth that belongs to every single believer. Perhaps this is the ultimate reason why her story has endured, despite every institutional attempt to reshape or diminish it. The powerful truth it intrinsically holds does not depend in any way on official clerical recognition. It lives on securely wherever it is genuinely heard, even if that crucial hearing takes place in a quiet, unassuming room far removed from the grand, official spaces of communal worship. One day, the Gospel of Philip may finally be read openly and universally, not as a direct threat to the Church's stability, but as an integral part of its own foundational inheritance. When that finally occurs, Mary will no longer be forced to stand in the shadow of vaguely remembered legends. She will stand precisely where she has always historically belonged, securely beside the very heart of the faith. Her voice steady, her presence completely unshaken, reminding all who choose to listen that fundamental truth does not simply fade away. It waits, and when the proper time is right, it steps boldly into the light. When that light finally illuminates her story, it will reveal not only Mary Magdalene in her true dimension, but also the original, authentic structure of the early church in ways that few have ever fully imagined. The Gospel of Philip does not present a church built upon rigid clerical lines and fixed, unchangeable roles. It profoundly shows a vibrant, living community bound together, not by designated position or rank, but by a shared, spiritual understanding and absolute trust. In that powerful vision, Mary stands as a crucial bridge between the human and the divine, a courageous witness who holds the most intimate, sacred teachings without any fear. The Vatican's long-standing caution, therefore, is not entirely without justifiable reason. Making her complete history public means asking for a new view of what leadership is, how we grant authority, and who is equipped to handle a sacred truth. These aren't minor issues, and once these questions surface, they aren't easily dismissed. The Church has always prioritized cohesion, but a unity built on excluded voices is inherently lacking. Since this Gospel's discovery in 1945, its discreet distribution has spread ideas in academic settings, through private collections, and in quiet discussions among the faithful. Mary's presence within the document has found room to develop. Every reader who encounters her there realizes a little more of what was kept hidden. And each one carries that image forward, even if just in private thought and worship. The power of her narrative rests in its straightforwardness. There's no dramatic attempt to overturn prior beliefs. It serves only as a reminder that from the very beginning, women were among the first to comprehend, to trust, and to speak. The Gospel of Philip makes no apologies for this fact. It simply presents it as natural, as if it could not have been otherwise. Should the Church ever choose to accept this perspective, it wouldn't eliminate the centuries of established tradition. Instead, it would enrich them, weaving back the elements that were once part of the whole design. The story of faith would become deeper, more rounded, and perhaps more authentic in its telling. Until that time, the Gospel of Philip remains exactly where it has been for decades, secure, preserved, and patiently waiting. Mary is waiting with it, her voice resting within the lines of a manuscript kept in guarded shadow. But truth inevitably finds its way into the light, even when the journey is long. And when it surfaces, her presence will feel less like a new concept and more like a return, a dimension of the faith that was always there, silently hoping to be remembered. When they remember, the faithful may feel they are not uncovering something foreign, but recognizing a friend they have always known. The Gospel of Philip doesn't require belief through argumentation. It invites it through recognition. Mary Magdalene's role feels both remarkable and ordinary. Remarkable in the confidence placed in her, ordinary in how logically that trust appears. She is not shown as a unique exception, but simply presented as part of the model of those who genuinely understood. The Vatican's hesitation to fully reveal this portrait may stem from recognizing how deeply it could shift the faithful's perception of their place within the Church. If the story clearly shows that closeness to God is not defined by rank, then every believer might begin to view their personal spiritual journey differently. Authority would no longer be based purely on title, but on the depth of one's listening, learning, and living of the truth. Since its surfacing from the Egyptian sands in 1945, the Gospel of Philip has lived a dual existence. One is public, where academics debate its meaning, and one is private, where its text passes from one heart to another without needing official endorsement. In both spheres, Mary's function is constant, solid as the tombstone she first approached. This persistence suggests that her story does not require official approval to endure. It's a truth that, once recognized, continues to grow in the collective memory. Even when discussed only in small gatherings, even if shared only through private reading, it stays vital. And in some sense, this slow, deliberate revelation reflects Mary herself, a witness who didn't clamour but spoke when the time was right. Perhaps that is the most profound lesson the Gospel of Philip conveys. The strength of truth lies not in how loudly it is proclaimed, but in how faithfully it is upheld. For now, the Vatican keeps it behind walls, in temperature-controlled rooms and protected archives. Yet walls cannot contain what is already understood, already in the spirit. One day, the Church may choose to let Mary's voice speak openly once more. When that occurs, it won't shock those who have heard her within these hidden pages. It will feel like the completion of a quiet, long-held promise. A promise that truth, no matter how deeply buried, will find its way back to clarity. And when that clarity returns, it will shine not only on Mary Magdalene, but on all the unstated narratives that waited beside hers. The Gospel of Philip is more than a single record. It's an entrance into a view of the early Church, where wisdom flowed in multiple directions, unrestricted by the strict boundaries that would later be established. In this view, discipleship was defined by insight and loyalty, not by who could claim the most prestigious position. Mary standing in that vision is firm and undeniable. She is not introduced as an outsider who had to earn acceptance. She is already present, standing among the closest followers, entrusted with knowledge others did not receive. Her existence alters the narrative we have long heard, and in doing so prompts us to consider what the Church would look like had that presence never been concealed. The Vatican, by conserving this text yet keeping it silent, has followed a careful boundary. It's as if they acknowledge that some truths cannot be eliminated, but they can be postponed until the moment feels safe. But moments in history rarely happen because someone decides they are prepared. They arrive because the strain of waiting has become too heavy to bear. Since its discovery in 1945, the Gospel of Philip has been carried forward, not by decree, but by curiosity. A professor here, a translator there, a reader moved to share it with a friend. Each advancement has been small, but together they have traced a gradual route toward the surface. The more it is read, the more difficult it becomes to return it to silence. The concept of Mary's story, told fully, is not one of discord, but of reunification. It would not negate what has preceded it. It would make the overall picture complete. It would allow the faithful to see the foundation of their belief, not as a narrow stone pathway, but as a broad road, one that has always had space for more than was displayed. Until that day, the Gospel of Philip remains in its private location, and Mary remains within it. Her voice neither shouted nor silenced, her presence neither absent nor fully acknowledged. She waits, just as she has always waited in the space between secrecy and disclosure. And when the moment comes, her story will not sound like something new. It will sound like something rediscovered, something that was constantly there, patiently waiting to be recognized again. In that instant of recognition, it will be as if the centuries between then and now merge into a single moment. The Gospel of Philip will no longer be a fragment tucked away in an archive, but a living part of the faith's history. Mary Magdalene will take her place not by forcing her inclusion, but simply by being accepted for who she truly was. There will be no need for discussion about her value. Her worth will be self-evident in the confidence she was given and the truth she embodied. The Vatican's long period of caution will be viewed differently. Then perhaps it will be understood not just as an act of control, but also as an effort to protect the Church from transformations it feared it could not manage. Yet history demonstrates that truth, once set free, has its own power to guide those who hear it. And Mary's truth, as the Gospel of Philip recounts it, is not a call to divide the Church, but to deepen it, to make it more whole. Since 1945, the manuscript has flowed like a quiet stream beneath the surface of public awareness. It has carved pathways through the minds of scholars, believers, and the merely curious. And just as water moulds stone, over time its steady current has begun to change the nature of the conversation about Mary Magdalene. The depiction of her in this gospel is wonderfully human. She is not set apart as a remote figure of perfection, but shown as someone who studied, listened, questioned, and understood. Her profound relationship with Jesus is built on mutual confidence, not on social standing. This is perhaps what makes her so relatable and what makes her so impactful. If that image were to fully enter the life of the Church, it could inspire every believer to see themselves as capable of that same intimate connection. Authority would not be seen as something granted only from above, but as something that can flourish internally, nourished by faith and insight. For now, she remains where she has been for centuries, present yet partially concealed. But every reading, every quiet sharing of her narrative moves her slightly closer to the open air. And when her voice finally reaches that space, it will not be to dismantle the faith, but to remind it of what it has always known. That truth is not a possession to be guarded, but a gift to be shared. And when shared, it can change everything, not by force, but by the gentle power of being undeniably real. When that truth is openly shared, it will not arrive with the clamour of bells or the harshness of sudden light. It will come softly, like the dawn, seeping into the quiet corners of a room. The Gospel of Philip will no longer be a relic to be handled only with gloves, but a living message carried into the language of sermons, into the prayers of the devout, into the hymns and narratives that travel from one generation to the next. Mary Magdalene will then be seen not as a figure distorted by centuries of misunderstanding, but as she truly was in the earliest recollection, a companion who grasped the core of the message and lived it without fear. Her reliance on Jesus and his reliance on her will speak to the potential for a faith not constrained by barriers, but woven through relationships of honesty and affection. The Vatican's long protection of the manuscript will still be significant, but the meaning of that protection will change. It will no longer be viewed as holding back, but as having safeguarded a delicate thread of history until it could be safely woven back into the structure. Those who have kept it safe, archivists, scholars, quiet keepers, will be remembered as those who, whether intentionally or not, carried a seed for the day it could be planted anew. Since its finding in 1945, the Gospel of Philip has been a seed travelling in the shadows. Every reading, every quiet discussion, every moment of recognition in the mind of a listener has been a preparation for the time when it will be spoken without hesitation. Mary's presence in those pages will stand as a reminder that the original church was wider, more welcoming, and more diverse than later history allowed it to seem. That reminder will not diminish the faith. It will enrich it, offering a more complete picture of the people who first brought it into the world. Until then, the manuscript rests in its protected place, and her voice travels only where it is invited. But voices like hers are not easily silenced. They pass through memory, through curiosity, through the desire to know more than what has been officially narrated. And when enough hearts have turned toward that desire, the door will open. Mary will step forward, not as a stranger to the church, but as a friend coming home. And her story, carried through centuries of quiet endurance, will finally be told in the clear light of day. When that day arrives, the telling will feel almost like a reunion. The Gospel of Philip will no longer be a subject of cautious academic study or hushed conversation. It will take its place alongside the other ancient voices, not as a competitor but as a complement to them. And Mary Magdalene will no longer be a figure seen only through the fog of myth or misinterpretation. She will be clear, steady, and whole, standing in the position she once held. Without defence, her presence will remind the faithful that the Church's origins are deeper and more complex than a single narrative can convey. In the earliest years, insight came not only from those later designated as leaders, but from those whose faith and understanding needed no title. The Gospel of Philip reveals that Mary's close bond with Jesus was built on this type of insight, and that such closeness was seen as a gift worth preserving. The Vatican's long, quiet period over the manuscript will be viewed with fresh perspective. Perhaps it will be understood as a form of waiting, a way to keep something vulnerable safe until the hearts of the faithful could receive it. History may judge this waiting as too long, but when the words are finally spoken openly, the years of silence will yield to the strength of their survival. Since its discovery in 1945, the Gospel has been like a lamp covered by a heavy cloth. The light was always there, but dimmed so that only those who approached could see it. Each careful reader, each translator, each keeper of the manuscript has lifted that cloth just enough to let the light reach one more pair of eyes. In the fullness of time, the cloth will be removed entirely, and the light will spill into areas it has never touched. Sermons will speak of Mary as more than a penitent. Art will portray her not only in sadness, but in wisdom. And prayers will invoke her not only as a saint, but as a teacher and companion. Until then, her voice remains like a tide beneath the surface, unseen but pulling consistently toward the shore. And when it finally reaches the open beach, it will not rush forward in one single wave. It will flow in again and again until its existence feels natural, inevitable, and right. In that moment, the Gospel of Philip will no longer be a concealed text, and Mary Magdalene will no longer be a shadow in the story. She will be what she always was, a living witness standing beside the core of the faith, her truth unshaken by the passage of time. When her truth finally stands exposed, it will feel less like an initial discovery and more like a return to something the heart already knew. The Gospel of Philip will be read without reservation, its language flowing into the cadence of the Church's life as if they had always belonged there. And perhaps, in a way, they always did. Kept alive in memory, in art, in quiet practices passed down away from the scrutiny of authority. Mary Magdalene will then be seen not only as the first witness to the resurrection, but as one who carried the profundity of the message in a manner that could not be erased. Her deep connection with Jesus, as depicted in the Gospel, will no longer be a source of discomfort, but a source of power. She will stand as evidence that the heart of the faith has always been wide enough to embrace the voices of both women and men. The Vatican's guardianship of the manuscript will be remembered not solely as control, but as an act of preservation, for without that careful, if quiet, protection, the Gospel of Philip might have been entirely lost. Its journey from the sands of Egypt in 1945 to the shelves of scholars and the imaginations of the faithful is proof of the resilience of truth. Even when it moves slowly, those who read it will find not a challenge to their faith, but an enlargement of it. The story will feel more complete, more human, more deeply rooted in the lives of those who walked alongside Jesus. And Mary's role will serve as a reminder that the Church's groundwork was built on the testimony of many, not just the few whose names have been most often cited. For now, her voice remains in that quiet area between secrecy and declaration. It is heard in study rooms, in small discussion groups, in the pages of translations read late at night by those who seek greater understanding. And each time it is heard, it grows a little stronger, carrying with it the promise of the day when it will be spoken freely to all. When that day arrives, the telling will not end with the Gospel of Philip. It will trigger the rediscovery of other voices, other fragments of memory long kept in the dark. But Mary's voice will lead them, steady and reliable, just as she once guided others. In the earliest days of the faith, and in her presence, the Church will discover not division, but a deeper unity, one built not on control, but on the shared truth that has been waiting, patient and clear, for nearly 2,000 years. When that deeper unity finally takes hold, it will not feel like something imposed upon the Church, but like something it has been evolving toward all along. The Gospel of Philip will take its place next to the established scriptures, not replacing them, but finishing the portrait they began to paint. Mary Magdalene will no longer be confined only as the repentant sinner of medieval sermons, but as the trusted companion remembered by the earliest followers. Her presence will give weight to the fact that the foundations of faith were set by many hands and voices. Some of those voices, like Peter and John, have been heard clearly for centuries. Others, like Mary's, have been softened by time and choice until they became little more than echoes. But the Gospel of Philip holds her voice firm, allowing it to resurface with a clarity that is difficult to ignore. Once heard, the Vatican's long silence will be seen in a new way. Then it may be understood as both a delay and a safeguarding, a means of keeping the manuscript whole through decades when it might have been dismissed or destroyed. The very act of holding it close has preserved it for this upcoming moment when the faithful will be prepared to hear it without fear. Since its rediscovery in 1945, the Gospel's journey has been a gradual unfolding, first into the hands of scholars, then into quiet translations, then into the imaginations of those drawn to the enigmas of the early Church. Each stage has brought it closer to the space where its voice will be welcomed openly. When that moment arrives, Mary's role will not be seen as a challenge to the Church's authority, but as a reminder of what true authority is meant to be born from insight, compassion, and a life lived close to the truth. It will encourage believers to look past titles and traditions to the deeper qualities that define a leader in faith. Until then, her voice will keep moving, quietly finding its way into the hearts of those who seek it. It will remain like a lamp shining behind a closed door, its light not completely hidden but softened, waiting for the hinges to turn. And when the door finally opens, the light will pour out without hesitation, touching every part it can reach. Mary Magdalene will then stand fully in that light, not as a figure rescued, but as one restored to her original place in the narrative. And the faithful, seeing her there, will realize that she was never truly absent, only waiting for the moment when the Church was ready to remember her as she was. When the Church finally remembers her as she was, the story of Mary Magdalene will feel both ancient and new. The Gospel of Philip will no longer be a rare text studied by a select few, but a familiar voice woven into the rhythm of worship and teaching. Her name will be spoken with the same ease as the other early witnesses, her memory no longer obscured by centuries of misinterpretation. In this more complete telling, she will not stand out as a figure of controversy, but as a natural part of the earliest group of disciples. The intimacy between her and Jesus, preserved in the delicate lines of the manuscript, will be recognized as proof of trust and mutual understanding. That trust will become an example for what the Church can be, a place where spiritual authority is given to those who embody its truths, regardless of the roles they have been given. The Vatican's long stewardship will be recalled as a paradox. By keeping the gospel out of the public eye, they also kept it from being lost or destroyed. It will be clear then that even in silence they were protecting something valuable, waiting for a time when it could be accepted without fear. Since 1945, the Gospel of Philip has existed in this delicate balance between obscurity and illumination. Scholars have brought parts of it into view, while believers have passed its text quietly among themselves. In both areas, Mary's presence has remained constant, like a figure in a painting, revealed slowly as layers of dust are removed. When the last of that dust is gone, the image will shine with a simplicity that defies distortion. Mary will be seen as she was, devoted, wise, and trusted. Her position will not diminish the others, but will give depth to their stories as well, reminding the faithful that the first days of the Church were built by a community far richer in voices than the official record has indicated. This rediscovery will not come with dramatic upheaval. It will unfold like the gradual brightening of a stained glass window as the sun rises behind it. At first, only faint colours will show, then shapes will emerge, and finally the complete picture will appear. And when it does, the faithful will see that the image was there all along, waiting to be viewed in its entirety. Mary Magdalene's story will then be openly lived, no longer a secret to be guarded, but a truth to be shared. And in that sharing, the Church will gain not only a more complete history, but a deeper comprehension of what it means to follow the one she once called teacher. When that deeper understanding takes hold, it will not erase the centuries that came before, but it will soften them. The story of Mary Magdalene will stand alongside the familiar accounts, not in opposition, but in harmony. The Gospel of Philip will become one more window through which the faithful can look into the earliest days of the Church, a window that admits light long blocked by stone and shadow. In this light, Mary will no longer be seen as a figure redefined by later generations, but as one whose identity was whole from the beginning. Her testimony to the resurrection will still be her most celebrated moment, but it will no longer be the only part of her remembered. The trust she carried, the closeness she shared, the teaching she may have passed on. These will find their place in the larger narrative. The Vatican's silence will be understood as a long period of waiting, like a gardener holding a seed until the soil is ready. The Church will be seen as having kept this fragment of truth safe until it could be planted without fear of it being crushed. That patience, though difficult, will have allowed the Gospel to survive unspoiled, waiting for the correct moment to grow. Since 1945, that seed has been quietly planted in the minds of scholars, artists, and believers who have found in Mary's story a deeper, broader faith. Each reading has been like water to the seed, strengthening it, preparing it for the day when it will rise into full view. Once this takes place, the Church will not feel less, but rather it will feel much bigger, deepened by the understanding that its origins spread out further than was initially thought. The account of Mary will not substitute for the long-standing customs that have defined worship over centuries, but it will make them feel more substantial. It will introduce comfort and seriousness, reminding the devoted that the Lord's message was handed down through many kinds of hands and expressions. Sharing her history will not feel like an order, but like an opening. It will invite every listener to picture themselves among those who witnessed the events, to remember that the closeness Mary had is not something that belongs only to a time gone by. This is a connection that can still be found right here and now by those who genuinely pay attention. And so, when her true perspective is finally shared fully, it will not sound like the arrival of a new thing, but the return of something precious. Something that has been waiting right outside the door, ready to come inside and be settled once more. When that highly anticipated moment happens, it will feel as though a vital segment of a well-known tune has been brought back. The fundamental tune will stay the same, but it will sound fuller, richer, more entire. The Gospel of Philip will naturally weave into the flow of the Church's life, its words no longer needing to be described as unique or divisive. They will simply become part of the greater blend, contributing depth without removing what has already been sung for generations. Mary Magdalene's place will subtly change in the minds of the people of faith. She will no longer be limited by the misidentifications and restricted roles she was assigned in the Middle Ages. She will be recalled as she was known in the very beginning, a person who demonstrated deep confidence, a voice that carried both strength and insight. The respect shown to her in the Gospel of Philip will become a natural element of how she is discussed, taught, and valued. The long period of careful silence from the Vatican will by then be viewed as both a strain and a help. The strain came from holding back a truth that could have benefited the Church sooner. The help was in keeping it safe from being lost or altered until the time was right for the world to receive it in its entirety. In this way, the silence will be seen not as a final moment but as an extended preparation. Since it was recovered in 1945, the journey of this document has been cautious and measured. It has been passed through the custody of those who wanted to guard it and those who were eager to present it. Through every stage, Mary's presence within its pages has stayed consistent, solid, like the truth she embodies. This consistency will be the reason her account fits so easily back into the rhythm of the Church, because it was a part of it all along. When the moment arrives that her story is related without reservation, it will not be met with argument or resistance from believers. Instead, there will be a quiet sense of recognition, as though hearts have been anticipating this moment forever. The sermons that speak her name will bring a feeling of balance restored, of something rightly returned. And perhaps the most significant shift will take place not within the walls of the Vatican or in historical documents, but in the private prayers of individuals. In these personal moments, the faithful will call on Mary not only as a holy figure, but as a teacher and an ally in belief. Her voice will guide them just as it guided others long ago, steady, patient, and certain, reminding them that truth, once entrusted, is truly never gone. It waits until it is accepted, and then it steps forward as if it had always been there. Thanks for listening all the way through. If the story of Mary Magdalene has given you a fresh perspective on history, please share your thoughts below in the comments. I'd really appreciate hearing them. And if you have not done so yet, please subscribe and enable notifications so you won't miss the next exploration into the hidden past of the Vatican. Until then, stay curious and may you have peaceful nights.